G'day, mate. 40 here. When I was a wee child, my mother in particular, but then also my father, became convinced that I was going to grow up to do something special for God one day. And how little did my parents know that their wee cherub would grow up to devote himself to destigmatizing sex work. That I would devote myself to being an ally to them sexy hoes, those saucy hoes. And what a moving Oscar ceremony, right? When the best actress, who just very convincingly plays a stripper and an escort, just an incredible acting performance.
I also just want to again recognize and honor the sex worker community.
Yes.
More Oscar nominations are equal to Gone with the Wind. It's terrible. It's a terrible movie that didn't even deserve to be nominated for one.
Sex work is something in which a person has agency and choice.
It's like a pretty woman.
I thought Anora was a pretty good flick. All right. I thought it was funny. I thought it was wise. It's certainly not for everyone. It's pretty sexually raunchy in the first hour. It doesn't bother me that Anora won for Best Picture, but this whole destigmatizing sex work, right? Most people don't want their daughters to grow up to be hookers.
It was sponsored by OnlyFans.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah. When you ruin it like this, it just becomes embarrassing.
Where was Shirley Bassey? Bring her out, you know? Well, last year, thanks to Barbie and Oppenheimer, the Oscars were labelled the year of the blockbuster. This year's theme might be apparently massive movies most of us haven't seen. Nominations were led by The Brutalist, The Substance, Emilia Perez, A Real Pain, Anora, and A Complete Unknown. Well, most of them were completely unknown, not just to me, but to most people, I would imagine. As a result, some are calling it the most niche and indeed, in the end, the dullest Oscar ceremony there's ever been. Where's Will Smith when you need him? So has Hollywood given up on crowd-pleasing, or is it our fault for not being culturally sophisticated enough? Here to give us their verdict on Hollywood's big night, author and movie critic Will Jordan.
Okay, let's go to Commentary Magazine. John Podhoretz.
As people know, I've been a movie critic for more than 40 years. I write movie criticism for the Washington Free Beacon intermittently now. And my favorite movie of 2024, Anora, did win 5 Oscars, including a 4, first time in history for its writer, director, editor, producer, Sean Baker. So creatively, I am perfectly satisfied. I want to talk about 2 political moments. One, of course, being the awarding of the Best Documentary Feature to a movie called No Other Land, made by 2 Israeli Jews and 2 West Bank Palestinians. And of course, they took the stage to say Israel must not do any more ethnic cleansing, and I'm doing this for my daughter so she shouldn't have to live under the horrible circumstances of the monstrous life that I'm living that has led me at the age of 32 to win an Oscar and stand on the stage in LA being garlanded by the entire world. That's how horrible life is for Palestinians on the West Bank who can find themselves on the Oscar stage. Oh boy, how terrible for them. Gee. And then I want to finish up with Adrien Brody, who won an Oscar for The Brutalist. This is Adrien Brody's 2nd Academy Award. For both Academy Awards, he plays a European caught in the Holocaust. In The Pianist, for which he won his first 22 years ago, it's a true story of a man trapped in the Warsaw Ghetto who managed to stay in his apartment for 2 years, never leaving his apartment. Vladislav Spil.
I didn't get the point of The Pianist. The main character didn't change. So, yeah, he may have stayed in his apartment for 2 years, but he didn't change. He didn't develop. So, what was the point of The Pianist?
The Pianist. And for The Brutalist, he plays a survivor of Buchenwald who ends up in the United States as an architect. Okay, 2 Jewish Holocaust-involved survivors. And so he is on stage, and after talking about how, him, himself, and what about him, and he, and his career, and careers, and we need life and love in the heart, and everybody in the world is going, get off stage already, he finally said, I dedicate this award to sort of like against anti-Semitism. And then instantly he said, I don't like racism, and I don't like othering. So I just want to... They both took time to pay tribute to the sex worker industry and to sex workers, because Anora, the title character of the movie, is a pole dancing stripper who does exchange sexual favors for money, though she's not explicitly a prostitute. Christine, not that I want to turn to you because you're a woman, but you are a social commentary columnist.
I get the prostitute questions on the podcast.
I said to my wife, like, I don't like this mainstreaming of sex. This has been a thing now for 20 years on the left. And I mean, I know I have a friend who is an academic who's done legal work, who's written legal things about sex workers. And the term sex worker itself is, of course, an effort to demoralize or to remove from moral condemnation the job of actually selling your body for money and selling your, whatever. So what do you make of this? And like, how bad is that morally, spiritually for the country and the world?
Well, I think it is bad. I mean, the only response to someone who wants to talk about sex work as a legitimate form of employment for women is to ask them if they would want their daughter to be one. And you'll get an immediate and visceral and moral response. But I do think it reflects where we are as a culture. OnlyFans has made sex work mainstream, and it's made it, I mean, it's turned it into like a version of Uber for people. It's most people don't make money on OnlyFans, but the ones who do make a lot, young women are flocking to it to try to, as their side.
So I used to be much more libertarian in these matters prior to writing a book on the sex industry. And the more time I spent around the sex industry, the more skeptical I became of the libertarian approach. It just became obvious to me after a year or so of researching the sex industry that the number one excuse that people had for working in the sex industry was it's moral because it's legal. That your average Joe connotes that which is legal is that which is moral. And if we completely decriminalize prostitution and we remove stigma from sex work, then more and more people are going to engage in it, particularly when people are young and hot, young women. All right, they're feeling their erotic power. And the thing that jumped out at me about people in the sex industry is they tended to lack ties. So if you're close to your parents, if you're close to anyone, right, you're highly unlikely to go into the sex industry because you don't want to bring them shame. So it's usually people who are discombobulated, don't have strong ties, and then they fill up their need for love by getting attention. And you can get a lot of attention if you're young and hot and female and you work in the sex industry. But people, the prefrontal cortex doesn't properly develop until people are 25. And so I believe that the community and the state and the tribe and the nation and the family and the extended family and the people, that they need to try to act as a seatbelt against terrible decisions by individuals, that we need more safety nets in society. We need more of a sense of the collective, because individuals just going off on their own will frequently make just the worst decisions. And so if you love your dad, you're not going to engage in sex work. But if you're close to your uncle, or you're close to a teacher, or you're close to a boss, or you're close to your Korean American community, or your stamp collecting community, you're highly unlikely to engage in sex work. And so it's not enough to just allow individuals freedom. All right, society has an interest in what you choose to do with that freedom. So that's why I'm not a libertarian. I am for some sort of stabilizing norms and even laws. And I don't know exactly where to draw the line, but there has to be some line. Because if you don't draw a line, then pornographers and sex workers will just take things to the max. So pornographers these days say, oh, what we're doing is upstanding, it's moral, it's legal because we don't work with kids. But prior to 1977, you could easily get kiddie porn at sex shops all across the country. It's only when Congress passed massive legislation against child pornography in 1977 that the major porn distributors stopped dealing in sex porn. It used to be you could go to live sex shows in Los Angeles in the early to mid 1970s and in San Francisco Bay Area. And do you really want live sex shows going on at clubs around you? So there has to be some kind of barrier. So when I was around the industry, they'd often talk about Euro versions of scenes, which would contain water sports and other things that you couldn't sell in the United States. And I don't know where exactly you draw the line, and I don't have a big argument about where you should draw the line, but there should be some lines drawn. People should not be exposed to pornography online unless they actively seek it out. And I would be all in favor of people having to register with their ISP and saying, I'm an 18-year-old and I'm over 18 and I want access to pornography. Otherwise, the normal person should not be exposed to pornography. It should not come up on X. It should not come up anywhere. You should have to take some extraordinary measures, right? And it just doesn't flow to you by default. So because I have such a skeptical view of human nature, I believe that we need to build up bulwarks as families, extended families, as a people, as a community, as a nation state. We need to stand up and create bulwarks against the human tendency to go lower and lower and lower, right? We have tendencies towards good inside of us. We have tendencies towards bad. It's just so often easier to go low, to go down. And particularly if you're not connected with people, right, you can just fall through the cracks right into the sewer, and you can end up writing on the pornography industry for a decade like I did.
Hustle now. Part of that is because we have demoralized and destigmatized things like prostitution, which are extremely risky ventures for women to engage in. And I think that is too bad. But I wasn't surprised, actually. I think I've become a little jaded about it. But to see someone as intelligent and thoughtful an actress as Mikey Madison, she could have just said the first part of her remark, which was, thank you to the people in the industry who helped me understand what their job is like, and left it at that. But now there's this compulsion for everyone to praise the most extreme thing now to look as if they're tolerant.
I mean, can I just say something? My problem with all the sex worker talk is that it's cleansing something. It's giving cover to something that is actually an awful, violent, not infrequently homicidal world for women who are preyed upon by...
Okay, the main problem with sex work and with pornography is not the death. All right, it's not the rampant death. It's not the rampant violence. All right, it is that it unsettles the moral fabric. And so my argument against a libertarian approach to sex work and to pornography is the same as my argument against same-sex marriage, is you're fraying the moral fabric. You're pulling on a string in our moral fabric, and you don't know what's going to happen when you pull on that string. That civilization is difficult to build and easy to tear down. A good life is challenging to build. It's really easy to destroy. And so I have more faith in our traditions, in our folkways, in the various bulwarks that we as communities, families, extended families, people, nation state, a religion have built up against the human tendency to dwell in the gutter. I mean, I've spent much of my life dwelling in the gutter. I sometimes go to the gutter with my humor. All right, I'm not someone who is above the gutter. But because I am so aware of spending time in the gutter, that I am keenly aware of our need to build up bulwarks. And it's not because of the homicide, and it's not because of the suicide, and it's not because of the STDs. It's because my primary argument is my traditionalist, conservative fear that I don't know what happens when we unravel the moral fabric. And it's my same argument against in same-sex marriage. It's not that I can specifically point, this is the terrible result of same-sex marriage. It is that I don't know what's going to happen when you let the male genie out of the heterosexual bottle. All right, I want men to be strongly encouraged to keep their sexuality just for their wife, or certainly just for a woman that they're going to be married to. I want it controlled. I want it contained. I want bulwarks. I want dikes. I want barriers. I want safety nets. I want these things to constrain our wild side. And it's not the murder that I'm most afraid of. It's the fraying of the moral fabric. And you say, oh, 40, that's so vague. What the hell are you talking about? You're right. I don't know what happens when you start pulling at these strings that uphold a fragile civilization.
Male criminals. I mean, what on earth is empowering about giving cover to this? This is crazy.
Well, these are the same people who would denounce Andrew Tate, too. That's the strange thing. There's a lot of contradiction in their moralizing and demoralizing.
Right. Anora itself, as a piece of art, is a movie that is very unsentimental about its title character and her sex work. She is a greedy, grasping, transactional, cold person who the movie sets up as a kind of weird moment where she has a Cinderella moment where she's going to get out of this scot-free.
So I am all on board once again with the Commentary Magazine analysis, and I really don't want to be all on board with the Commentary crew, but they're right here.
That's the setup. Is a guy comes along who decides he's rich, he's crazy in love with her, and he's going to take her away from all this. It's like Pretty Woman, right? And then it isn't like Pretty Woman, and I don't want to talk about what happens in Anora because it's so fantastic. You really should see it. The second hour of Anora is the best American comedy made in the last 20 years.
So I've only once lived with a woman for 3 months, right? And her favorite movie was Pretty Woman. I'm amazed at how many women just love that film. And she would dress up into lingerie to see this film. And I was assured of sex afterwards if we watched Pretty Woman. I don't understand why. It's the fantasy of a man coming in and protecting you, providing for you, and taking you away from your mundane and disappointing life.
And so it must be seen to be believed, so I don't want to talk about it. But the movie does not treat Anora, the sex worker, as the hooker with a heart of gold, like Julia Roberts in Pretty, who won't kiss, right? Julia Roberts won't kiss her Johns because that's the thing that she keeps for herself in the course of her terrible existence, right? But Anora is a highly flawed, deeply flawed person for whom we nonetheless come to feel compassion because she got this glimpse of escape from the life that she was trapped in, and then basically has the rug pulled out from under her. So as a piece of popular art, it does not serve as a calling card or a message about how sex work is just another form of work in America. She is diseased by what she does. Her soul is curdled to some extent, either by what she does or the fact that her soul is somewhat curdled is the reason she can do what she does. But then there's this PR campaign on behalf of sex work on the stage of the Academy Awards.
Well, it's a major part of the Los Angeles economy. So, I mean, I think that, and many of the people in the audience last night probably partake of it. So, but you know what's interesting is that at the same time that more and more people began producing of their own volition a lot of amateur porn and going on OnlyFans and, this kind of professionalization of and transactional approach to sex was when suddenly we see this discussion of sex workers. It's like, oh, well, there's professionals here and it's an industry and we need to protect them. It's like, actually, everybody's
Okay, have you heard about the Voyage of the Damned? Right. This story has achieved mythological status, and once I tell you about it, you'll say, oh, yeah, I've heard of this. All right, this is from the Wikipedia entry. So in 1939, in June 1939, this ship, the St. Louis, carried more than 900 Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, intending to escape Europe. And the refugees first tried to disembark in Cuba, but were denied permission to land. Then the ship went to the United States and Canada. They tried to find a nation to take the Jews in, but those nations refused. So finally the ship returns to Europe, and various countries such as the United Kingdom, Belgium, Netherlands, and France accept some refugees. Many are later caught up in Nazi roundups, and so approximately a quarter of them end up dying in death camps during the Holocaust. So this story has achieved mythological status, and I want to deconstruct this story a little bit. So let's get beyond the
In
mythology.
1939, Captain Gustav Schroeder attempted to save just over 900 Jewish refugees from the horrors of Nazi Germany. Since 1933, the Nazis had been establishing a vast network of concentration camps and ghettos, setting the stage for the deadliest genocide in history. Just under keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Require written authorization from the Cuban Secretaries of State and Labor, and the posting of a $500 bond. By this time, the Cubans had already accepted about 2,500 Jewish refugees, and many resented the relatively large number of refugees entering the country at this time. Like many countries, Cuba was suffering from the Great Depression, and refugees were seen as competitors for a dwindling number of jobs. Jews were often labeled as communists. And 5 days before the ship departed, Cuba had its largest anti-Semitic demonstration in history, with over 40,000 spectators. A former Cuban president, Grau San Martin, sponsored the rally, where one of his spokesmen, Primitivo Rodriguez, told Cubans to fight the Jews until the last one is driven out. The St. Louis arrived in Havana on May 27th. Only 29 passengers were allowed to disembark, 4 Spanish citizens, 2 Cuban nationals, 22 Jews with valid U.S. visas, and 1 passenger who was brought to hospital after attempting to commit suicide. The remaining 907 refugees would have to go elsewhere. But the St. Louis would find the United States in much the same mood as Cuba. The Great Depression had left millions out of work and fearful of competition with refugees or immigrants. In 1939, the vast majority of Americans opposed joining World War II and opposed relaxing restrictions on immigration. 3 months prior to the voyage of the St. Louis, a bill to allow the admission of 20,000 additional Jewish children from Germany died in committee. Sailing north along Florida's coast, passengers cabled President FDR asking for refuge. He did not respond, but one passenger received a message from the State Department instructing them to wait their turns on the waiting list to qualify for entry. Because of immigration quotas established back in 1924, that waiting list was several years long. Behind the scenes, Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, advised President Roosevelt not to accept the Jews. And when Captain Schroeder sailed close to Florida's coastline, Hull instructed the U.S. Coast Guard to follow the ship closely to prevent refugees from jumping ship and swimming ashore. Several other attempts to find refuge in Latin America failed. Then a group of Canadian academics and clergy tried to persuade Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King to allow the passengers safe haven in the Great White North. Chief among their opponents was Frederick Charles Blair, Canada's Director of Immigration, who in a 1938 letter boasted about his careful control of pressure by Jewish people to get into Canada. Mackenzie King sided with Blair, and the St. Louis returned across the Atlantic, finally docking in Belgium on June 17th with all 907 passengers still on board.
The liner St. Louis, turned back from Cuba, brings its human cargo to port at last. 907 Jewish unfortunates without a country, permitted to land in Belgium after 5 weeks of suspense afloat.
Okay, so that's the mythology. It was made into a Hollywood movie called The Voyage of the Damned. But what was the reality? So first thing that jumps out at me when I look at the Wikipedia entry, it does not mention the Dominican Republic. And the dictator of the Dominican Republic, he wanted to bring in tens of thousands of Jews, but absolutely no mention of the Dominican Republic. Now, I asked Google AI. St. Louis did not go to the Dominican Republic, says Google, because despite initial discussions, the Dominican Republic ultimately refused to accept the Jewish refugees on board, meaning they did not have the necessary permission to land there. And that's what all the AI programs tell me, but not exactly true. I asked Grok, so that's the AI program on X. Did any country offer haven to Jews in the German liner, the MS St. Louis? And again, the answer does not mention the Dominican Republic. So yes, several countries eventually offered haven to the Jewish refugees, but the haven was all from these European countries that understood that these refugees would soon go to the United States. And so I follow up with Grok. Did the German liner, the MS St. Louis, stop in the Dominican Republic, and were Jews allowed there? And I'm told no, it did not become a destination. So the Dominican Republic was the only nation out of 32 participants in this July 1938 conference, the Avion Conference. All right, the Dominican Republic agreed to accept up to 100,000 Jews. All right, it was made by the dictator Rafael Trujillo, which is confusing, right? Because we think that dictators are automatically bad people. But more than any other country, Rafael Trujillo at the Dominican Republic, all right, wanted to bring in Jews. Remember, the Dominican Republic and Haiti, they're part of the same island, but the Dominican Republic is much more prosperous, and Haiti is much more of a hellhole. So Haiti versus Dominican Republic. I'm sure there are some good videos that talk about the difference, how they became two worlds. Let's compare them. Why is Haiti so dangerous and the Dominican Republic thriving? Well, maybe the reason is because the Dominican Republic is so racist. Did you know that almost nobody in the Dominican Republic wants to identify as black? They will pretty much all dismiss the idea that they are black. I find that curious. Why is Haiti so dangerous and the Dominican Republic is thriving? And doggone it, my YouTube videos are really slow to run.
Lucky country in recent decades. But while some luck is involved, the current state of Haiti can be tracked back to the long, incredibly sad history of how the country got its start. But what's perhaps more remarkable in all of this is that Haiti shares its island with the Dominican Republic, an otherwise pretty safe, wealthy, and stable country. Here's why Haiti is in such a bad state, and the Dominican Republic is actually pretty good. Welcome to Geography by Jeff. Today we're off to the Caribbean to look at the island of Hispaniola, the home of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. While the two countries share a relatively small island, their current situations could not be more different. History. You see, the island of Hispaniola was first landed on by Christopher Columbus in 1492. In fact, Columbus would actually set foot on what is...
So, super complicated reasons for why Dominican Republic apparently is thriving, but Haiti is so dangerous. Okay, so Trujillo set up this huge agricultural colony at Sosua, which is now a haven for the sex trade, God forbid. So there's a happy ending to this brutal story. And it's not the Jews who created the sex trade in Sosua. Okay, that was started by non-Jews in the 1980s, but supposedly it's a paradise for men. And you look at the video and you can see why this is such a paradise for men. It's a low-rate sexscape, according to one book I read. Okay, so fewer than 500 Jews ultimately settled in the Dominican Republic, Sosua. And why so few? Main reason was that the Roosevelt administration was afraid of spies. And so they made it really difficult to obtain visas. So the Dominican Republic wanted to accept up to 100,000 Jews, but very few of them ended up going there. So I asked Grok, did European Jews fleeing the Nazis not want to go to the Dominican Republic? And I'm told that that's an oversimplification. There's rather a combination of practical, logistical, and psychological factors. Many Jews were desperate to escape Europe, would have gone anywhere offering safety. But the Dominican Republic was an unfamiliar tropical country in the Caribbean. It was far from the cultural and familial ties that most Eastern Europeans had. There were language barriers. All right, they spoke Spanish rather than Yiddish or German or Polish. There wasn't an established Jewish community. And the prospect of starting over as agricultural settlers, right, may have been less appealing to destinations such as the United States or Palestine, where they had stronger cultural and ethnic connections. But the main reason why the Dominican offer wasn't taken up widely by Jews is that America made it very difficult to get visas. Now, why did the dictator Trujillo want Jews? Right, because he wanted to whiten the Dominican Republic, and he wanted to improve his international image after massacring 15,000 of illegal Haitian immigrants. For some reason, he didn't want Haitians in his country. He didn't want that enormous capital, human capital that was offered by the Haitians. Like, why would you not want to tap some of that enormous
and the Dominican Republic
capital
is on the eastern side, and separating the two is a series of mountain ranges that effectively split the country in half geographically. On the eastern Dominican side, storms blow in from the east, bringing rain and precipitation to create lush and verdant tropical.
Yeah, it's them mountains and them storms. That's the reason why Haiti has astronomical rates of crime, why Haiti repeatedly massacred every white person who was there, and then has developed into a total hellhole, while the Dominican Republic is a pretty decent place to live. So apparently a lot of Latin American nations and their leaders wanted to substantially whiten their population. But that was just because they were inheriting colonial racist attitudes. I've done my academic research on this. So I asked Google AI, why didn't more Jews fleeing the Nazis go to the Dominican Republic? Google says only a small number made it there due to strict immigration quotas from America, geographic distance, difficulty obtaining visas, and that most Jews sought refuge in countries like the United States. And according to New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage, Trujillo hoped that light-skinned European Jews would bring the skills, energy, prestige, and capital which he associated with white Europeans. he hoped that the Jews would intermingle with local Dominican women and make babies with them. So he wanted a much higher percentage of young men than young women. And so he wanted to whiten the skin tones of the Dominican population. So the Dominican Republic was the only sovereign country willing to accept mass Jewish immigration immediately prior and during World War II, the only alternative being the Shanghai International Settlement. And there was also an Alaska plan to settle Jews in Alaska, but that was buried due to a lack of support from many Jews. And Jews weren't particularly thrilled to go to the Dominican Republic. And as soon as they could, they left. So I looked at, I wanted to find why more reasons for why Jews didn't go to the Dominican Republic when it was really the only sovereign nation that wanted to take them at the end of the 1930s into the 40s. So I read a 2011 academic paper, The Voyage of the St. Louis Revisited, right? And this was by a professor of Holocaust studies. So where's the Voyage of the Damned here?
But
okay, I'll play this in the background. And this article demythologizes the story. So the story of the St. Louis, right, includes as much myth as it does history, right? It was in large part the ineptitude of the primary American Jewish negotiator, Lawrence Berenson, that prevented Jews from landing, right? It was Berenson's ineptitude. So of the 620 passengers who returned to continental Europe, 365 survived the war. Now, those traveling on this ship, the St. Louis, they were not refugees during their voyage to Cuba, but they became so during the return trip. All right, they had visas to Cuba, but as Jews poured into Cuba to escape Europe, there was rising anti-Jewish feeling in Cuba. So Jews initially obtained visas to go to Cuba on a tourist visa, $160 each. So 80% of the passengers, right, had this tourist visa, but they weren't tourists. They were intending ultimately to immigrate to the United States, but the United States had quotas up. So there were conflicts in the Cuban power structure, and people were trying to get as much money as possible. And so they said, hey, these are not tourists, these are immigrants, and they need to each post a $500 bond. And the Jewish guy who was negotiating for the Jews on the ship, he was not very clued in to what was really going on. And so it was his own ineptitude that was a large part of the reason that Jews didn't get off the boat in their intended destination of Cuba. So there was an unexpected rise in anti-Jewish attitudes in Cuba. And Berenson, right, the main guy, the American Jew who was negotiating things, he was repeatedly urged to take up this offer by the Dominican Republic to allow passengers to disembark in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. And Berenson was reluctant to do that, right? He wasn't interested. And when he was pressed, what's your reason for your reluctance? He was quite vague. And so he apparently didn't want the Jews to get off in the Dominican Republic. And then the Dominican Republic, when they saw that the Jews on the St. Louis were being refused entry to Cuba, they then upped their fee, right? They then required a $500 fee per person. And Berenson and the Jewish committee handling this matter thought, oh, this is outrageous. This is a fee that's imposed only on Jews. And so even though the Dominican Republic was happy to bring in 100,000 Jews, all right, they didn't negotiate this situation very well. Right? They said, oh, we're not going to consent to any procedure where there's a special fee charged for admission for Jews only. So the Dominican Republic offer remained open, but as the situation on board the ship became more difficult, then the Dominican requirements became more financially onerous. And Berenson was just simply incapable. And so in all the mythology regarding this ship, you don't hear about how incompetent the lead negotiator was for American Jewry. All right. And here's the author. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the primary responsibility for both the failure of the negotiations and the refusal to consider alternatives, such as the Dominican Republic, rests with this guy, Lawrence Berenson. Now, the St. Louis, right, the voyage of the St. Louis, it took place in June of 1939. So World War II had not begun yet. Right, so we did not have a Second World War. We did not yet have a Nazi conquest of Western Europe. We did not have a mass extermination of Auschwitz. Right, people did not know what was coming. So Ernest May writes that Western leaders anticipated the German offensive through the Ardennes. Even as a worrisome contingency, it is almost inconceivable that France would have been defeated when and as it was. Unfortunately, the best German divisions led their offensive through the Ardennes, and they were met by the worst, least effective French divisions. So if that ratio had been a little bit more even, right, World War II would probably have ended right then and there. So it's not like, oh, the Germans, they're just such incredible fighters, and the French are just a bunch of wimps and defeat us, and the reason that the French grow trees next to their boulevards is so that the Germans can have shade when they march through. No, it was the bad luck that the French had their worst divisions matched up against the best of the German divisions, and so that's why the German offensive in May of 1940 through the Ardennes was so successful. So if it had been different, right, you would have seen Germany's defeat and a French victory parade in Berlin. Now, after World War II and after the 1960s, when we start talking about the Holocaust, its magnitude becomes so great that attributing the Holocaust simply to Hitler or to the Himmler or to the Nazis or to Germany or even to Europe, it just seems insufficient and to some people. So even though there are all sorts of factual empirical problems due to chronology, geography, documents, right, there has been a widespread movement since the 1960s that the guilt for the Holocaust must be spread over more and more of the world, and including the United States. Right, and so the voyage of the St. Louis is portrayed as some giant moral condemnation of the United States. But the U.S. stood alone in 1939 in its commitment to accept 27,370 permanent German immigrants who are overwhelmingly Jewish annually. And so if Roosevelt had said, oh, allow this ship to dock, all right, if he had ignored the law, all right, if he had breached the quotas, all right, then other German Jews other Jews in Europe would not have been allowed in. So the popular perspective now is, oh, Roosevelt, he was just so unfeeling. But when you had this ship, the St. Louis, circling in the Straits of Florida, you had immigration committees of both houses of Congress in executive sessions engaged in a contentious hearing on a joint resolution aimed at relaxing temporarily the country's immigration quota to allow in 20,000 German refugee children. But immigration was an incredibly polarizing issue in the late 1930s because there was enormous unemployment. Why would the United States want to bring in immigrants when there's enormous unemployment? So Americans feared losing their jobs. They feared not finding their jobs. So it makes sense that Americans were overwhelmingly opposed to any government resolution allowing more immigrants into the country. More immigrants reduces the power of labor and the wages of labor. So advocates for the St. Louis or for refugee children just so sure that they have the moral high ground, just like supporters of Ukraine, just so doggone sure that they have the moral high ground that they ignore the fact that a majority of the country is probably not with them. So you had a political environment that completely precluded Roosevelt taking unilateral action with regard to the St. Louis. You had a political environment precluding congressional support for landing the St. Louis passengers in the United States. Right? Roosevelt knew that if he let the passengers of the St. Louis into America, others who had already been told that they could come, they would then be shut out. So plenty of other Jews would have been trapped in Europe. Right, the president at the time had considerable opposition, and his opposition might well have eagerly unified in an anti-Roosevelt campaign, and the president might well have lost the 1940 election if he had allowed the St. Louis to dock in the United States. So in the end, only about 500 Jews found refuge in the Dominican Republic, even though the dictator of the Dominican Republic, right, he was down with 100,000 Jews. Now, he set up an agricultural settlement in Sosa for these refugees, but many of them didn't want to work in agriculture, right? Many of them looked down on manual labor, right? Many of them just didn't like the Dominican Republic compared to what they'd seen of Palestine or the United States. And so labor Zionist Marie Serkin visited Susa in 1941, and she wrote, "Be foolish to expect a Jewish refugee from a concentration camp to burst into a horror when he spots the shores of Puerto Plata or Susa. We know that when Hitler is defeated, the world resumes immigration to Palestine will proceed with even greater impetus." So no Jews at all would have bothered to settle in the Dominican Republic if there had not been an emergency. Right, today there are 3,000 Jews left in Susa. So we have two books about these 500 Jews who escaped the Holocaust and moved to the Dominican Republic. And they moved to the Dominican Republic, and there's virtually no anti-Semitism there. So you can't build a shtetl in a country without anti-Semitism. That was one Susa Comics observation. The Dominicans welcomed the Jews. Now, the Jews tended to look down on the Dominicans. So it's interesting that it was racial thinking that convinced the dictator of the Dominican Republic to want to bring Jews to his country, right? He wanted to whiten his country, right? So from one perspective, right, 6 million white people died in the Holocaust. So in one perspective, racial thinking is behind the Holocaust. In another perspective, racial thinking is behind escaping the Holocaust. Right, to this dictator, Jews were the right kind of people to repopulate his nation. So he held on to, believe it or not, anti-Jewish tropes, guys. He thought the Jews were hardworking. He thought the Jews were good at making money, and he thought that they had high cultural standards. So you've got these Jews who are mostly urban, and they had to lie, essentially, to Jewish refugee agencies to say, oh, yeah, I'm willing to work the land, willing to be a farmer, willing to plant crops, milk cows, build homes, right? And some of them were, but many of them were not. They were supposed to do all their own work, but many of them ended up hiring native labor. And it was the U.S. government that was largely responsible for impeding Jewish immigration into the Dominican Republic, right? It had initially favored the project as a means of rescuing Jews while keeping them outside the United States. Then the Roosevelt administration quickly turned against the effort because it was believed that Nazi spies would infiltrate the refugees. Now, no Nazi spies were ever found in Susa. So Rafael Trujillo is the dictator of the Dominican Republic. He wanted to deflect attention from his slaughter of 15,000 Haitian illegal immigrants. He wanted to erect barriers against Haitian immigration by populating the western section of the country, and he wanted to whiten the nation. Many Latin American nations at this time wanted to whiten their nation, and he wanted young Jewish male immigrants, not so many females, so that the Jewish men would intermarry with the locals and whiten the country. So we have another book about this. It's called Tropical Zion, General Trujillo, FDR, and the Jews of Susa. And so two of the Jews who are running this operation, one writes a letter to the other. There's an unfriendly attitude towards the settlement project in certain high American government quarters based on the fear that German immigrants will be traitors. And there's the same fear from Dominican army circles that German spies will be brought in. So, where is his little doco?
We had a joint kitchen. All the women took their turns cooking for everyone. We had a joint dining hall. Everyone ate together. The houses did not have individual kitchens. It was really a communal living.
Very often we had no water. There were earthquakes. With all this, we were glad to be alive.
And at Sosua, life and industry had been speeding on with all the enthusiasm and ardor that typify a people charting a new beginning. Hundreds of virgin acres were cleared in the first months. The settlers were picked for health and fitness, and the sturdy pioneers were not found wanting.
They worked very, very hard in unbelievable heat.
And you got to understand that these people were either merchants, intellectuals, or in business. None of them were agriculture.
I've never stuck anything into the ground that came out again. It was a completely new experience. We tried everything. We tried bananas, which flourished.
Los dominicanos eran que ordeñaban y se ocupaban del arreglo de los animales. Cada colono tenía un grupo de dominicanos empleados también.
So I learned how to work on a pig farm. I learned...
So, yeah, the main moneymaker for a while on this Jewish agricultural settlement, the Dominican Republic, was raising and slaughtering pigs.
How to make butter and cheese. I learned agriculture. I had to clear pasture to live. And I had intention to go eventually on my own farm.
But through the months of work and play, the Sosua settler strives toward one goal, his own homestead. At the end of the concentrated training period, it is the hope of each worker to claim his own property.
The Joint Distribution Committee made that everybody who learned something about agriculture will get 40 hectares land and 10 cows. When he was married, he got 1 cow more for the wife, and for each child, 1 more cow.
My father decided that that was no life for him to be on a farm. Somehow or other, he could not adjust to that kind of life.
There were some people who were not on the farm. There were teachers and doctors, hairdressers. One worked there in a supermarket.
One time a chemist from Czechoslovakia was there, so he came to me and says, Ernie, could you build this?
Okay, bring it on home, Luke 4 says the chat. Can you make a cogent point about how this affects your day-to-day existence in sunny LA? Yes, it is the difference between mythology and reality, the importance of the situation. Right, some of my familiar themes. So it was supposed to be an agricultural settlement, but many of these Jewish refugees, they were not interested in doing manual labor. Right? Most Ashkenazi Jewish men have primarily worked in white-collar occupations since the 14th or 15th century. Right? And so there's often this rhetoric, oh, Jews are not in agriculture or not in manual labor because they were prevented from owning land because of anti-Semitic laws. But smart Ashkenazi Jews are not generally going to want to work in manual labor. So it's supposed to be an agricultural colony, but it became a refugee camp in large part because people didn't want to live there and they were just hanging out there until they could get to the United States. So many of the European Jews lied about, yeah, I'm willing to work in agriculture, but once they get here to this Caribbean island, they were not nearly so willing to work. They bring in the Brookings Institute, all right, that venerable Democratic Party left-wing NGO, non-governmental organization, to do a report on this settlement. And this is what they concluded. Here is a rising tide of color that must inevitably engulf all but the most carefully prepared and protected white settlements. Many of the communities' negroidation of the whites is complete, and with but few exceptions, miscegenation absorption is gradually coloring such white groups as still remain in the Caribbean area. So they bring in this left-wing Democratic Party, NGO, and its main concern is that there would be race mixing. So when the Dominican authorities read this report, they're livid because their motivation for admitting Jews was precisely to whiten the population, not to segregate it. There was some intermarriage.
Still, I say, I could vaguely remember when I was apprentice, the farmers used to come to my uncle to build a still to make moonshine. We finished the job.
So the European settlers were expected to do the manual labor, right? The founders of this Jewish agricultural colony did not want to mirror the paternalistic landlord-peasant relations found throughout Latin America, but they end up doing just that. Also, and I can kind of identify with this, many of these Jewish refugees were reluctant to learn Spanish, even though the Dominican Republic leaders strongly encouraged it, but they thought that Spanish was a peasant language, and they didn't want to learn it. And I had 3 years of Spanish in school, but most experiences with Spanish speakers in some individuals' lives are not the most exhilarating, and so many people are just too darn racist to learn Spanish, including many of these Jewish European settlers, right? The Dominicans were not anti-Jewish, but the European Jewish settlers looked at the Dominicans as barbaric and primitive and backward. So the Dominicans thought highly of the Jewish Europeans, and the settlers, these Jewish Europeans, they looked down on the Dominicans as uneducated and backward. So there was a rare intermarriage. So Louis Hess became the first settler to wed a Dominican woman. And the Dominican Republic wanted this Jewish settlement to encourage miscegenation, but the Jews were quite upset when they learned of the engagement, and Hess was admonished. He was setting a bad precedent. They tried to dissuade him from marrying. Didn't he realize that his offspring would have dark skin and nappy hair? My God, can you believe that these Jews fleeing Hitler were racist? Now, the couple wed, and his Dominican wife learned to speak German, and she converted to Judaism. So for many of these settlers, they did not regard manual labor as in their enlightened self-interest. These city slickers quickly developed an aversion to hard work. One woman, Judith, musician with classical training in Vienna, was appalled that she had to scrub pots and wash dishes in the community kitchen. So the colonists quickly acquired enough rudimentary Spanish to learn the expression mucho trabajo, poco dinero, right? Favorite saying among Spanish workers. Mucho trabajo, much work, poco dinero, little money. So the romance surrounding this agricultural settlement quickly gave way to the reality of toiling beneath an unrelenting tropical sun. And so the settlers would ask the Jewish agency that funded this agricultural settlement to lighten their load by hiring local field laborers. And the European Jewish colonists tended to be quite arrogant, and they regarded los muchachos as inferior. And one distraught Jewish woman wrote to a Jewish leader, "There's a very sad thing, the racial problem. Our Jewish settlers do not behave civilly to the working population. They consider themselves a higher race. They consider the natives peons." The Zionists did not like this because they wanted all the Jews to settle in Palestine. So the Zionists were filled with scorn for this settlement. And the State Department just would not admit Jews after they let in 500. Now, Sosa, the biggest change between 1940s and the 1980s is it's become a sex tourism spot.
And very primitive everything, but it worked.
We built two big industries there. One was called Silka. They took all the milk every morning and made butter there. They made.
Okay, here's a Washington Post story by a beautiful blonde woman. I thought I knew how my family escaped the Holocaust. The truth was hidden in a Dominican town. And here's the author, Emily Kodik. Beautiful blonde woman. And some NGO funded this essay. All right, so she says, the night before Kristallnacht, the infamous date in November 1938 when synagogues burned across Germany, the Nazis arrested tens of thousands of Jews. Right, her family managed to escape from Europe. And they fled to one of the few places in the world willing to take Jewish refugees. Did I fail to show you the photos of this beautiful author? Right, here she is, Emily Kodik. So a family escaped Berlin and they went to Sosua, a remote beach town on the northern coast of the Dominican Republic, whose dictator, Rafael Trujillo, had offered Jews safety for a promise to develop the land. This is a story I heard countless times. It was paradise, my 89-year-old Aunt Hella would say, weaving my family's heritage into a little-known part of Holocaust history. But the story never really made sense. I was told that this small Caribbean country saved my family at a time when more powerful nations refused to do the same. In return, the Jews transformed a jungle coastline into a peaceful settlement with a hospital and a school. And then the story always ended the same way. So Sosua had been ruined, I was told. Its streets overrun by prostitutes and foreigners. The town had become a destination for sex tourism, tainted by pickpockets and drugs. My family moved away like so many others and never returned. So she ends up going to this town. My father warned me to stay away. He said the beach had become a site for prostitution and crime. Tourists can find here any sex they might want. Straight, gay, sex with trans people, even sex with minors. Prostitution's long been a part of Dominican culture, but nowhere does it feel more entrenched than in Sosua. The industry exists in the graves of life, largely unregulated, widely known but rarely seen. Sex trade took off there in the 1980s and 1990s after an airport opened and foreign tourists flooded the town. So Dominican women facing low-paying job prospects head to Sosua, hoping to find profitable sex work and maybe even land a husband. So prostitution increases, more and more sex tourists arrive, and you can find dozens of prostitutes just lining the sidewalk in front of busy open-air restaurants and bars filled with foreign men. So Sosua is supposedly a paradise for men. Now, many locals are upset that prostitution has consumed the town's reputation. All right, and she goes and does some investigating, and she talks to someone who's an executive in a successful dairy and meat cooperative founded by Sosua's Jews. And I asked him, what else is important to me to know? Like, what things won't I find in the history books? And then he made a reference to a best-selling book I had never read about a fictional small town where sex, gossip, and scandal hide behind the pretense of paradise. Sosua, he said, was a small Peyton Place. Peyton Place was this scandalous novel from the 1950s. I didn't understand. What did a racy novel have to do with my family's past? So she digs in. She does some investigating. Goes into the archives. And she reads exit interviews from why people were leaving Sosua, why these Jewish settlers left. One says, I could not stay the sun. Another says, I had nothing to do there. Another says, the agricultural work was too hard for me. Then others said that they felt threatened by German Jews. I was attacked by 12 men while sleeping in my bed. That's why I preferred to leave Sosua for fear that they might kill me. So the early Jewish settlers felt dispirited and pessimistic from the start. They came to Sosua unprepared, unexperienced, unselected, in an undeveloped area. And they were instructed to get into farming, but they end up finding success in a dairy and meat operation that sells pork. So the Jews who moved there were fighting amongst themselves, screaming at each other. Just the community just racked by divisions. One refugee listened to a German radio broadcast, and another became enraged by the propaganda and ripped the radio out of its socket and smashed it. One main reason Sosua fell apart as a Jewish agricultural settlement, it was not the backbreaking agricultural work, right, or the desire to find a better life in the United States. There were just very few girls, Jewish girls. So there are 158 single men and only 38 single women. Right? Trujillo sought out men because he wanted them to whiten his nation's people. Settlers had to ask for permission anytime they wanted to leave Sosua. The nearest major town was hours away, or by horseback, or hour by car. That made romance between the Dominicans and the Jews difficult. So these conditions helped spawn cases of adultery in the small community, constantly witnessed and whispered about. You never knew in the morning when you woke up which young man had slept with a married woman. And it wasn't only single men sleeping with married women. The settlers gossiped about both husbands and wives engaging in affairs. So there was sexual turpitude that resulted in cases of syphilis. So there are 2 books published about this Jewish haven. One's called Dominican Haven, the Jewish refugee settlement in Sosua. So in 1942, doctors warned men to stay away from bordellos and unknown women, and assuming their advice would be ignored, to use condoms. So the whorehouses were in a poor neighborhood on the south end of the beach. So the Jewish refugees were largely on the north end, and so if they wanted sex, they had to venture south. Today's sex industry is different. It employs women from across the Dominican Republic and Haiti who take spins around town and on the beach looking for clients. And so, as part of my public service duty to you, I read an academic book on this topic by a Georgetown University anthropology professor, Denise Brennan. She wrote, "What's Love Got to Do with It?" So it was the Jews, not the tourists, blamed for Sosua's demise, who first visited prostitutes. But that part of the story has been conveniently lost in the retelling. When I get back from Sosua, I call my Aunt Heller. She tells me, times were hard. I asked her about the affairs. Yes, she says, people would trade partners. That was a mess. So this story was supported by a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. Now, as part of my due diligence, I read that book by Denise Brennan. What's Love Got to Do with It? Transnational Desires and Sex Tourism in the Dominican Republic. So Dominican sex workers tend to idealize foreign men, European men. Right? They dismiss European men's imperfections. They tend to describe them in idealized terms. And they tend to have contempt for local men. Right? They have very vivid descriptions of the failings of Dominican men, particularly their drinking and womanizing. So Sosua began as a safe haven for European Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. It's now a refuge for criminals on the run, for foreigners seeking a more privileged lifestyle. It's a good place to require, and for those valuing anonymity, it's a place to launder your money. It is a sexscape, right? That's the practice of sex work in the forces of a globalized economy. So the defining characteristics of a sexscape: 1, international travel from the developed to the developing world; 2, consumption of paid sex; 3, inequality. So in a sexscape such as Sosua, there are differences in power between the buyers, the sex tourists, and the sellers. And these differences are based on race, gender, class, and nationality. And these differences become eroticized and commodified inequalities. So with sexscapes, the sex trade becomes a focal point of a place, and the social and economic relations of that place are filtered through the daily selling of sex to foreigners. So Dominican migrants imagine that once they get to Sosua, anything can happen. So it's a town that Dominicans travel to, hoping to get rich quick. And so there have been instances of Europeans coming to Sosua and then marrying a local woman and taking her back to Europe. So many Dominicans think, if I can just go to Sosua, right, I'll find a European man who will take me back to Europe. But that doesn't happen very often, and usually the women end up returning to the Dominican Republic and heading downward in economic and social mobility. So foreigners emphasize the exotic and the erotic. Right? They seek in the margins of the third world a figment of their imaginations. But the Dominicans, too, have imaginations about the opportunities to be found in the sex trade with the tourist money, and the tourist lifestyles back home in Europe. So these fantasies are two-way. So the economy of desire is based on difference. You have Dominican sex workers and foreign sex tourists forging new practices and new meanings of love. So the Sosuan sex workers, right, understand their trade as strategic performances, hoping for a visa. Now, apparently there aren't pimps, and in Sosua there is not the coercion of women into selling sex. So these sex workers have a good deal of control. They are not trafficked into this trade. They are drawn to it through their female social networks of family and friends who work in the scene. So European sex tourists see Dominican sex workers as exotic and erotic and pick local women as a commodity for their pleasure and control. Dominican sex workers see the European men as also exploitable. The men are dupes. They are walking visas who can help the women leave the island and leave poverty. Now, what usually ends up happening is that these fuckers end up just getting by. They don't tend to improve their social status or their children's futures. So the Sosuan sex workers try to get the men to fall in love with them, and in the process, they must deliver the expected and agreed upon sexual goods. So you can understand the sex tourist as the quintessential postmodern man who avoids fixation and keeps his options open as he seeks sexual encounters without emotional involvement and desires something different, without commitment but still safe. So Sosua provides an experience as a backdrop for these sexual transactions. You have European consumers of paid sex. They have an array of choices in Europe, right? But they prefer often to fly to the Dominican Republic and participate in these sexscapes in the developing world. So it's not just the relatively cheap price for sex, it's everything is cheaper than at home. So foreigners are able to afford everything they desire, and they can enjoy feeling rich. Right? They can feel like a big shot. They can be the big man. So back home, they have low social and economic status. But here, their money goes farther, and they have more of it compared to most Dominicans. So they are sexually and romantically pursued by multiple young, beautiful Dominican women. Sex is just one more commodity they can purchase. They can even buy it in bulk, because they can afford to have sex with several different women on each day of their vacation. And then these sex tourists often return. It's like the TV show Cheers, where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. Right? These returnees get to know the owners and the operators of the hotels, the lunch shacks, the restaurants, the bars, the nightclubs. They get to know the dancers, the bartenders, the waitresses. Right? Just a friendly, homey place like Cheers. And the Sosuan sex workers, they don't see marriage to foreign men as ending other romantic and sexual relationships, right? They recognize that they can still share love and sex with other partners even once they marry a European man. Now, these Dominican women are seen by Europeans, particularly by Germans, as filled with sexual availability and proficiency. And the exoticism and eroticism, guys, I got bad news. It comes out of colonial racist discourse. So there are colonial racist dichotomies that run through colonial discourse. There's native instinct contrasted with white self-discipline, native lust contrasted with white civility, native sensuality contrasted with white morality. Man, I can't believe how racist people are in their sex tourism. Now, it is one thing to have an Afro-Dominican girlfriend on vacation, but many people find it's an entirely different matter to bring her home to meet family, friends, neighbors, and co-workers. Things are pretty racist even in the Dominican Republic. Light-skinned migrant sex workers from Colombia in the Dominican Republic work under better conditions for higher pay than darker-skinned Afro-Caribbean women. Few of the Afro-Dominican women I interviewed in Sosua's sex trade identified as black. They range in skin color, and they privilege their Spanish ancestry over their African ancestry, as well as a mythic Indian past. They describe themselves using a variety of terms, but not negra, not black. Right? Blacks and mulattoes make up 90% of the contemporary Dominican population, but Dominicans have, for the most part, denied their blackness. The Dominican elite is much lighter skinned than the regular Dominicans, and they emphasize their strong European heredity and their purity of blood. So this mulatto, genocidal, racist dictator, who was a Holocaust hero, Rafael Trujillo, who ruled the Dominican Republic from 1930 to 1961, he covered up his African ancestry. He used skin lightening creams. And he commissioned biographies that said his parents were pure French and pure Spanish. And he hated black Haitians. So the Dominican elites were obsessed with skin color and race. Faced with the inescapable fact that their country shares an island with Haiti, they erected barriers of racism, guys, and prejudice to distance themselves from their poor, dark-skinned neighbors. There's an ideology of anti-Haitianism in the Dominican Republic. It scapegoats Haitians. It marginalizes Afro-Caribbeans. It's an ideology that says the darker you are, the more likely you are to be poor. And it tries to intimidate the darker ones from making demands or participating in politics. And there's just so much racism. This is what breaks my heart in this sex trade. The Haitian sex workers and the Dominican sex workers, they rarely socialize. They rarely live together. Why? Because Sosua's Dominican boarding house owners generally refuse to rent rooms to Haitians, men or women. Right? Haitian sex workers are forced either to cluster together in those rare boarding houses or rent them or rent their own homes. They generally don't speak Spanish fluently. I never met a Dominican sex worker who spoke Creole. So these language barriers are keeping these two groups apart. And then there's just so much Dominican anti-black racism. Right? The Haitians are the poorest inhabitants of this island, so they migrate to the eastern part of the island for menial and backbreaking work, notably in sugarcane fields. Now, Germans are the largest group of sex tourists. They are the number one foreign residents in Sosua, and most of them seem to come from working class or lower middle class status back in Germany. So they're rednecks, racist, adventurers, out for a poke, out for a bit of fun. These men are losers back home who couldn't make it in their home environment. And the author, who's an attractive blonde woman, found it uncomfortable to interview sex tourists, especially when they were drunk. And it was quite difficult to find foreign men in Sosua who were not drunk. But due to her diligence, right, she found some sex tourists that she got to know, and she became fond of some of them. Right, and she recognized that their kindness to their girlfriends and to their girlfriends' children And their embrace of Dominican sex culture means you can't dismiss all of Sosua's sex tourists as unfeeling cads, right? Don't stereotype. Not all sex tourists are unfeeling cads. And the Dominican sex workers, right, they're exploitative too. They're hoping to strike it rich off these sex tourists. But they often end up disillusioned, right? They think they can make money and meet a gringo, so they come to Sosua. They enter sex work because they want the money and the visa so fast. They come with big dreams, but then they find out it is all a lie. Now, there are often carnivals in Latin America, particularly Brazil, and the essence of the carnival is that you cannot tell male from female, rich from poor, black from white. So these differences that are ordinarily so crucial may not matter for the duration of the carnival. Right? During the carnival, everything is free, everything is possible. Problem is, carnivals do not last. And you'll be shocked, there's a high amount of corruption in Sosua. All right, there's government corruption, political corruption, sex corruption, police corruption. So Sosua is a synonym for corruption. It boasts about the most crooked police force in this island paradise.
Culture is pretty widely pornified, and there's plenty of people who will do this just for the kicks, as we've seen with people who later then try to run for office and have to explain away their amateur porn videos. So it's in a strange sense, they are trying to professionalize something that now people will do for free. And so there's a strange tension there in terms of the market for this stuff.
But it is, as the father of daughters, Seth is the father of daughters. And by the way, porn doesn't just kind of distort and do deep psychological harm to the girls and women who participate in it. It does deep psychological harm to the men, I think, in particular, who are its audience and its consumers. But in the case of one as a parent or Americans as parents, this is yet another thing that one is now obliged to have conversations about because of the way people in the culture, it's like people, 25 years ago or whenever that was, people were like, why did Bill Clinton do this to me? I don't want to talk about what they're talking. I don't want my 7-year-old to say, what did Bill Clinton do with Monica Lewinsky? What's on Monica Lewinsky's dress? Why do I have to have this conversation? You made me do that. And some of that blame attached to Clinton and some of it attached to Kenneth Starr. It was like, why are you even looking into this? It's none of our business. And now you've written this report that everybody has to talk about their children with. Thanks a lot.
I believe that Russia wants to make a deal. I believe certainly the people of Ukraine want to make a deal. If somebody doesn't want to make a deal, I think that person won't be around very long.
Deal or no deal?
I think it takes two to tango.
We should go after waste, fraud, and abuse in every agency of government. There's no argument about that.
Big Balls goes to the Pentagon, and the left riots.
Nobody voted for Elon Musk.
We have someone that is occupying the White House, and as far as I'm concerned, he is an enemy to the United States.
Haters gonna hate. Democrats in search of their own Trump.
What is important to them? Authenticity, balls, and charisma.
Plus, who are you?
Father Evil, and I live under your bed.
He got kicked out of the White House on Friday. The staff ate his lunch, and he spent the weekend flapping his gums. Ukraine's president told the AP the end of the war is very, very far away. Trump says, you sure about that?
President Zelensky supposedly made a statement today in AP. I'm not a big fan of AP, so maybe it was an incorrect statement, but he said he thinks the war's going to go on for a long time. And he better not be right about that. That's all I'm saying.
A senior White House official tells Fox everything is on the table. And breaking tonight, Fox News alert, the U.S. is hitting the brakes on arms to Ukraine. The Trump administration has stopped financing new weapons sales to Zelensky and is considering completely freezing weapons shipments from our stockpiles, pausing military aid to Ukraine. So Zelensky does the right thing. Isn't that what Democrats impeached him for? Why aren't Democrats calling for impeachment? Suddenly it's not a high crime and misdemeanor. I guess not. This move will certainly bring Zelensky back to the bargaining table.
We should be more appreciative because this country has stuck with them through thick and thin. We've given them much more than Europe, and Europe should have given more than us because, as you know, that's right there. That's the border.
Okay, I found an academic perspective on this Jewish agricultural colony in Sosua, talking about the history of the murder of 6 million Jews in World War II, symbolically labeled as the Holocaust, and the history of collective Jewish response to the murder, symbolically understood as the State of Israel, have defined a single ideological arch. This has offered no place for the kind of haven symbolized by Sosua or by Uganda or by all the other alternatives for Jewish settlement outside of the State of Israel.
I'm not knocking Europe. I'm saying that they were a lot smarter than Joe Biden because Joe Biden didn't have a clue. He just gave money hand over fist, and they should have been able to equalize with us. In other words, if we gave $1, they should have given. Well, we gave $350 billion. They probably gave $100, but on top of it all, they get their money back because they're doing it in the form of a loan, and it's a secured loan. So when I saw that, which I've known about for a little while, I said it's time for us to be smart.
Trump right on Truth Social saying Europe has spent more money buying Russian oil and gas than they have spent on defending Ukraine by far. Elon says it's time to leave NATO. That's probably a good cop, bad cop play. And the Europeans are already feeling the heat. Over the weekend, they pledged billions more in defense spending, which is exactly what Trump's been urging them to do for 10 years. And this benefits the United States because we've always wanted a more beefed up European military alliance to deter Russia. And if the Europeans take the lead in defending Ukraine, they're even considering putting European boots on the ground, America can take a breather and replenish our stockpiles, which are running dry. So we're combat ready for China in case they try something. But making our allies step up is treason to our good old friend Rach.
I think whatever Americans voted for, I don't think people voted to make the United States a subsidiary diplomatic entity to Vladimir Putin, which is the way that Trump is operating here. One of the things that we saw today were leaders of democracies from all over Europe publicly thanking Zelensky today, standing with him in solidarity after this meeting with Trump. You talk about whether or not the United States is any longer associated with the free world.
America has a history of doing business with Russia. JFK used to write secret letters to Khrushchev behind the CIA's back in an attempt to end the Cold War. Reagan and Gorbachev had a record number of summits and signed historic arms treaties. The Gipper and Gorby had a great relationship. Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw into his soul. And Hillary tried so hard with Moscow, she handed them a reset button to reset their relationship. Trump knows Putin's a snake, but isn't he just resetting the relationship to bring peace?
All we're trying to do here is figure out whether a peace is possible. All these other things that people keep bringing up, that'll have to be a part of a negotiation. Right now, there is no negotiation. Shouldn't we at least try to see if there is a way to end this war in a way that's acceptable to both sides and is enduring and sustainable? How is that a bad thing? I really am puzzled why anyone thinks that trying to be a peacemaker is a bad thing. It's only a bad thing when it's Donald Trump trying to do it. When it's President Trump, it's absurd to me. Shouldn't we all be happy that we have a president who's trying to stop wars and prevent them instead of start them? And I just don't get it. I really don't, other than the fact that it's Donald J. Trump. If this was a Democrat that was doing this, everyone would be saying, well, he's on his way to the Nobel Peace Prize. This is absurd.
Ever since Hillary blamed Putin for stealing the election, Democrats had an enemy they actually wanted to fight. Before that, Bill Clinton was making speeches in Moscow for $500,000. House Oversight says Moscow sent Hunter Biden $3 million checks. Now the Democrats want to look tough and fight an unwinnable, winless proxy war. Now, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, the Russians, the Americans all want the war to end, except the Democrats don't. We thought Zelensky wanted the war to end, but then something happened.
It takes two to tango, and you're going to have to make a deal with Russia, and you're going to have to make a deal with Ukraine. I think everybody has to get into a room, so to speak, and we have to make a deal. And the deal can be made very fast. It should not be that hard a deal to make. It could be made very fast. Now, maybe somebody doesn't want to make a deal. And if somebody doesn't want to make a deal, I think that person won't be around very long. That person will not be listened to very long. Because I believe that Russia wants to make a deal. I believe certainly the people of Ukraine want to make a deal. They've suffered more than anybody else. We talk about suffering. They've suffered.
White House sources say Zelensky has 3 strikes. Strike 1 was tearing apart the mineral deal they had weeks ago.
I was personally very upset because we had a conversation with President Zelensky, the vice president and I, the 3 of us. And we discussed this issue about the mineral rights. And we explained to them, look, we want to be in a joint venture with you, not because we're trying to steal from your country, but because we think that's actually a security guarantee. And he said, sure, we want to do this deal. It makes all the sense in the world. The only thing is I need to run it through my legislative process. They have to approve it. I read 2 days later that Zelensky's out there saying, I rejected the deal. I told him, no way, that we're not doing that. Well, that's not what happened in that meeting. So you start to get upset by somebody. We're trying to help these guys.
Strike 2 was walking into the White House without a suit. The White House asked Zelensky to wear a suit to the meeting, just as a sign of respect. And Zelensky shows up in a long-sleeve T-shirt and cargo pants. Strike 3 was inside the Oval Office.
The tragedy of Friday, and I don't know what President Zelensky was thinking, we had President of France, Emmanuel Macron, in on Monday. Great meeting. We had Prime Minister Keir Starmer on Thursday. Fantastic meeting. They were all on board the arc of the peace agreement.
Okay, so I started watching some excellent TV shows. There is Berlin ER, a German TV show with English subtitles. It's excellent. Then there's The Pitt, which each episode is during an hour at an emergency department shift at the fictional Pittsburgh Trauma Medical Hospital. It's fantastic. Fantastic, The Pitt, right? An American medical drama series. And then season 2 of the TV show 1923 is out. And season 2 is incredible. It stars Harrison Ford, Helen Mirren, and the writing is so good. A lot of wise insights into life. So here's a guy, and he makes the point that when I encounter someone who has a cause, all right, that's someone I can trust.
In for trouble. Gave you food, the finest suite in the finest hotel in the city. Had planned for you a splendid night, only to show you gratitude. Look how you repay my hospitality. I never asked for it, and I don't want it.
Right, and so why did he run away from his hospitality? Because he had a higher obligation. So the first guy speaking, he felt betrayed, but betrayal is just this hyperbolic term we give when other people have different priorities from what we expected.
I am needed in Montana. My family is in...
Right, for a normal person, his family will be his number one obligation, and everything else has to come second.
In danger. My wife is lost to me, and I don't have time for hospitality. Yes.
Right, there are things more important than being gracious. There are things that are more important than being a pleasant recipient of hospitality.
I am hunter who leaves Africa for America to hunt men instead.
Well, why would he want to hunt men? To protect his family.
For your family, huh? That's what Lucas says. It's a war over land. My family's land.
Right. Land doesn't inherently belong to anyone. Right. Land only belongs to those who can seize it and protect it and keep it.
And they're losing it. I know that war. My family already lost it. Still, we have a problem, you and me. You show me disrespect, and disrespect is contagious, if not death.
Yeah, disrespect is contagious, right? If you're a leader and you allow people to disrespect you, that can become contagious. I've often been bewildered. Why are these people treating me with disrespect? And then it was only recently I realized that my openness was coming out of a place of emotional neediness. And when I stopped sharing things, that made me appear pathetic, then people treated me more respectfully, right? If I show a lack of respect for myself, other people will pick up on that and amplify it.
That's in the moment he appears. So he must go away. Seems that you wish that anyway. Questo vive, ho bisogno di lui.
Non mi fido di lui.
Questo vive.
Right, so you can't hang around. If you're showing disrespect to the leader, you've got to go, but you want to go.
Angelo seemed to be worried about trusting you.
Right, because the protagonist beat the heck out of him.
If I was Angelo, I wouldn't trust you either, judging by his face. But a man with a cause can always be trusted.
But a man with a cause can always be trusted. Right, I think that's a great line. Man with a cause can always be trusted. And season 2, episode 2, this rich man sees these Norwegians in Montana skiing down a slope, and the rich guy says, "Wow, I can make a lot of money creating a ski resort." And it's impressive how he just sees an opportunity, and he sees things that other people are just going to completely pass over on. Right? The wise man, the intelligent man, will see things that the normie
Whiskey,
completely misses. And this can frighten you.
Leave it to the Scots to ride out the storm in a saloon.
I don't need some dirt and seeing us together. You with that badge on your chest.
Right, it can be frightening when you recognize that the person that you're working for knows you better than you know yourself. It can be frightening when the people that you're with are so much smarter than you are.
No Duttons in town to see us. No one in here to see us at all.
Except the bartender.
That memory fades with a tip.
So one of the best guides for life is live as though there's a camera capturing everything that you're saying and doing, and then presenting it in a fair, balanced way on the front page of the New York Times.
Yep.
You a religious man?
No less than the next, I guess. I've called on him when I needed. Still breathing, so I guess he'll listen. You?
I believe I'm a sinner who'll never see the gates of heaven. But I believe they exist.
Well, that's quite an admission, right? Not many people can hold those two thoughts in their mind at the same time. They believe in the gates of heaven, and they believe that they will never see them. Right? Usually, it's impossible to live with these kind of incompatible beliefs. Right? You usually give up one or the other.
Whitfield can look at a mountain and see the gold deep inside it.
Right? The wise man, the smart man can look at something and see gold.
He saw those Vikings sliding down the mountainside like otters, making fools of themselves. And he sees a business in it. Sees a fortune in it.
Man of vision.
Right? The wise man, the intelligent man, he will see all sorts of things that you miss.
There's no vision. He sees through us.
Right, the wise man, the smart man. Right, he can see through you at times.
Sees the greed in our hearts.
Have you had a boss like this, or a mentor? Right, someone who can see right through you, see the greed in your heart.
I've never met a man who scares me. Not once in my life, until now. The man scares me, Clyde. He fucking scares me to death.
Right? You meet someone who can see right through you, someone who can read you more accurately than you can read yourself, understand yourself. That can be scary. So, Donald Trump's cabinet is populated by people who look good on TV, populated by people who are effective on TV, who are effective on podcasts, but some of them are terrible administrators. The SecDef, Pete Hegseth, there's absolutely no reason to believe that he is capable of running the Pentagon. There is no reason to believe that Bobby Kennedy is capable of running HHS, Health and Human Services. There's no reason to believe that Kristi Noem is capable of running the Department of Homeland Security. So My two biggest fears about the Trump administration is that it will be characterized by corruption and incompetence. And we're seeing signs of this. And Mark Halperin picks up on that this afternoon.
Sam put up the Politico graphic about the HHS. It's another thing that could be a canary in the coal mine. The spokesperson at the Department of Health and Human Services quit today after clashing reportedly with Bobby Kennedy about his overall management style and about what he's doing about, is it the measles outbreak? Is that what it is? The measles outbreak. Okay. Yeah. So yes, I never heard of the guy. I never heard of the guy who quit. I can't vouch for the Politico story. That's the reason. But I will say there's a number of cabinet secretaries, and I would name them thusly. You can take that down. Bobby Kennedy, Pete Hegseth, Kristi Noem. There's a couple others who, like, managing these departments hard. Forget MAGA. Forget ideology. Forget, standing up to owning the libs and confirming. Like, my biggest doubt about most of these people is, can they run the department and manage the staff? Because they're all mercurial in one way or the other, right? And to have this guy quit, because this is a guy who quit, as I read about him, he's not a holdover. He's not some deep state bureaucrat in sandals and beads ready to quit to make a point. He was brought in by the administration. So, Alex, is it possible that this is a sign that some of these people may not be able to run these things? Because when the spokesperson quits, it usually means they see trouble coming and they don't want to be out there of the voicing and defending the trouble.
Well, here's what I can tell you about RFK based upon some of the reporting that I've done, which is that he came in feeling very emboldened to make the kind of changes that he wants. He did not come in with his tail between his legs. He came in feeling like he was going to go in and say what he wanted to say and do what he wanted to do. And that's going to rub some people the wrong way. Some people are going to go along with it. Some people aren't. But you can bet that there's going to be, look, there was chaos in RFK's presidential campaign. We forget about that, but it was a very chaotic operation. And I remember when they were trying to lock down the whole...
Close to the most ever. Let's be honest. It was close to the most ever.
It was chaotic when they were trying to line up his endorsement of Donald Trump. I mean, it was chaos up until the very end. And so RFK is coming in feeling emboldened, feeling like he's going to do what he wants to do. There's going to be some clashes in that department for sure. It's a big, complicated department under normal circumstances.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's going to be some churn there for sure.
Yeah. What about you, Matt? Do you look at this as I do as potentially a sign that there's going to be more than churn?
I mean, well, I guess my question is, I don't know this guy. Maybe he's great. Maybe he's not. I have no idea.
Yeah.
What the hell do you think? Like you were going to walk into? Like, I guess my question is, I guess some people reported over the measles response. I mean, look, you gotta know you're going into a operation that's a work in progress at best, right? And you need to be able to bring structure to that. If you are suddenly finding yourself with massive I can't work for you disagreements on policy, I would just wonder, like, what do you?
Well, but I can interrupt you just because I don't think this is over policy, would be my guess, right? I think, and this is I tried to talk about this in terms of Musk as well. Like, there's competence and there's ideology. And there's certain traits, again, this has got nothing to do with pro or anti-MAGA. There's certain traits in a good boss, right? Mm-hmm. Like benevolent, not mercurial, fair, tells you what's expected, doesn't put you in a bad position through their own actions, right? To me, those are good traits in a boss in any business, regardless of whatever. And these people are not that. They're not that.
No.
And so you say, what did you expect? I can tell you, again, I don't know Bobby Kennedy at all. I've met him, but I'm not some expert. But I can tell you that I could easily imagine somebody offered that job and can't believe the extent to which he is not a good boss. Can't believe it when they get there. And I bet you that's what happened.
My only read on that was based off a report I saw. I think it was Yahoo or somebody that said it was about or around the measles thing.
Yeah.
That's all.
But Politico story says also just his general managerial oeuvre and style. And again, like, if you just look at that guy's history, and as Alex, you pointed out, his presidential campaign was you could call it a clown show, and then you'd have to write an apology to the clowns. It was a mess, and he wasn't suddenly magically imbued through the confirmation process with the capacity to manage.
And look, in with these things, eyes wide open. I mean, you got to understand exactly your point, right? This is not trying to think who's somebody who's great, adept at running agents. He's not going in Tommy Thompson's HHS.
Right.
And so you got to go, look, you got to balance it. Be like, look, this might be a learning curve, or, to put it lightly, and I can help bring structure, or it's not for me. And you do your best to do something else. But that you got to go in eyes wide open.
Yep. All right, let's bring folks in again. If you want to be in on the conversation, you're here in the two-way platform, please raise your hand as we bring in.
Okay, Steve Saylor has dropped a post. It's thought-provoking. New York Times columnists favor Trump's war on DEI, right? You weren't expecting that. New York Times columnists favoring Trump's war on DEI. In a survey of 10 New York Times regular columnists, on average, these New York Times columnists rate Donald Trump's DEI policy as beneficial, and they're not terribly upset about Trump's crusade against transmania. So will Trump's more hilarious moves, such as ordering Justice Department prosecutors to drop corruption charges against New York City's black Democrat buffoon of a mayor, Eric Adams, help his better initiatives, such as opposing DEI, transmedia, and unenforced borders by taking the heat off them? Are anti-Trumpists trying to sound reasonable in their opposition by not vociferously denouncing everything he does the way they did in the first term? Well, here is one data point. New York Times opinion section, long the bastion of the establishment worldview, surveyed 5 of its columnists and 5 of its contributors on Donald Trump's first month. On average, Donald Trump's anti-DEI campaign was judged positively. And the New York Times pundits didn't object much to Donald Trump's attempts to roll back many of the lunatic policies promoted by previous administrations during the trans frenzy of the last decade. Right? They dismiss this rollback as the least consequential of the 11 issues. Now, will Trump's more ill-judged stratagems tarnish the good stuff as well? The third least objected to Trump initiative is his old-fashioned mainstream GOP attack on economic regulation. Fourth least hated is Trump's immigration policy, followed by his moves with the military, such as firing DEI-promoting generals. The most loathed Trump projects are rescuing Mayor Eric Adams, because Adams said he would cooperate with Trump's deportations, RFK Jr., and science and Doge. Trump's Ukraine policy is unpopular with the Times writers, and they rank Ukraine as the most significant issue. Right, so these 10 pundits are 90% white, 70% are white men. So the executive editor of the New York Times since summer of 2022 has been Joseph Kahn, and he's quietly restoring professionalism to the New York Times after the ideological, nervous breakdowns of the Great Awakening. And out of these 10 pundits, 5 have identified as conservatives at some point. David Brooks, Ross Douthat, David French, Daniel McCarthy, and Matthew Schmitz. And liberal Nicholas Kristof seems to be edging towards the right. And Tressie McMillan Cottom, co-host of a podcast with Roxane Gay, is the only obvious DEI hire of this selected group. So only Ben Rhodes, who was one of Barack Obama's more articulate staffers, seems to recognize that protecting DEI and affirmative action needs to be a big deal to Democrats on the basis of reward your friends and punish your enemies. So there's still a ban on publicly discussing just how big the gaps are in objective intelligence between groups. Few pundits seem cognizant of how severe the consequences are of finally enforcing the 14th Amendment's promise of equal treatment of the law and what that would do to the black middle class. There's a clear vibe shift going on over DEI. We saw how weakly stock photo DEI woman Kamala Harris did after being handed the VP job. Right, so one thing that was striking about Kamala Harris is that no Democrats of any significance were speaking positively of her prior to her succeeding Joe Biden. Right, she is long prospered by being not quite as much leftist as you'd expect from a black woman San Francisco Democrat, but she felt the left-wing gale blowing towards the end of 2019. She went all out on Jussie Smollett, equity, and taxpayers subsidizing sex change operations for illegal immigrants. 2024, Kamala Harris did well only among the most intersectionally privileged, such as black women, and among the more socially insecure upscale suburbs in the flyover states, such as the genteel suburbs outside of Kansas City, who probably lagged too far behind the times to notice that the racial reckoning was old hat by last November. My favorite columnist is probably Christopher Caldwell. Kip says, I saw Dennis Prager on 2 different shows. All right, these are reruns. All right, he's not going on any shows right now. So Christopher Caldwell, he is out with a new column. And he always has interesting things to say. He says Zelensky is like Trump. Right? People who like Zelensky dislike Trump. They don't notice that the Ukrainian leader is probably the most Trump-like politician in the world. I didn't expect that analysis. Last Friday's Oval Office meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky was supposed to end in a lunch, an East Room signing ceremony for an agreement to mine some of Ukraine's strategic minerals. Instead, it ended with a shouting match, at the end of which Zelensky and his entourage were ejected from the White House. So Trump has not yet shown himself as reluctant to feed Zelensky's war machine as he is to feed Zelensky's delegation. But Ukraine is looking for a fallback plan in case the U.S. withdraws support altogether. There really is no such viable plan, which is why late Sunday evening Zelensky trumpeted his willingness to sign Trump's minerals agreement. So the closest thing that Ukraine has to a fallback is the European Union. So the idea, the fantasy is that EU leaders such as British Prime Minister Keir Starmer could take over leadership of the war from Donald Trump. So Keir Starmer insists against all evidence that Russia does not hold all of the cards in this war. And he insists that Russia's economy is in shambles. And Emmanuel Macron, the leader of France, has floated sending ground troops. And he's shown interest in a bilateral arms production agreement with Ukraine. And the German new leader, Friedrich Merz, is also gung-ho. So all these European leaders subscribe to Joe Biden's doctrine that the world is divided into democracies and autocracies, and Russia's on the wrong side of that divide, and they may put Trump on the wrong side of that divide too. So they are adjusting to Trump's new policy, pay up and step up. They believe the U.S. exaggerates how much it gives to Ukraine. They claim their contribution is half. So all these European leaders are meeting to try to cobble together a rump NATO, right? EU-friendly politicians meeting to try to create a NATO without the United States. So they have the will, but they do not have a way, right? Giorgia Meloni's Italy is really on board with Trump's approach. Hungary and Slovakia are also on board with Trump's approach. They don't want to antagonize Russia. The EU simply cannot provide Ukraine with what it needs. Right? The West has filled Ukraine's long-standing deficit in artillery shells. So the Ukrainians could conceivably fire Anglo-French Storm Shadow missiles instead of American ATACMS. But Ukraine's main military problem is something that no amount of money can solve: a dire lack of manpower due to emigration and draft dodging. Right? Why would you want to die in the last days of this fight that's unwinnable for Ukraine? So you've got dramatic scenes of press ganging and resistance across Ukraine. The average age of the Ukrainian soldier is over 43. And there are all sorts of specific functions that only the United States can carry out: intelligence gathering, targeting, logistics. Now, should Europe begin to develop such capabilities, right, that would then become a threat to the U.S. and to NATO, right? The 3 Ds: no decoupling, no discrimination, no duplication. So European-funded Ukrainian war effort would effectively undermine NATO, and now that a leading Norwegian energy company refused to supply American ships, just gives more impetus to the United States to pull out of NATO. So President Trump is not anti-Europe, right? That's only plausible if you think Europe is the European Union. But Trump does not share Keir Starmer's view that the Russian-Ukraine war was caused out of the blue by Russia's barbaric invasion, right? That was Joe Biden's view, right? Under Trump, there's a different understanding, right? Trump's team do not think moralistically about the war. They think in terms of the two countries' strategic and military interests. It is a deeper, is a more historically grounded view than Joe Biden's, right? It has much in common with that of Chicago University professor John Mearsheimer. So the biggest unresolved problem of the 1990s was when the Cold War ended. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic floated free of the Soviet Union with pieces of Russia embedded in it, such as Crimea and the Donbass. Right? There's not a long history of Ukrainian sovereignty. Right? There's not a long history of some separate Ukrainian nation state. So some people hope that Russia would become pro-Ukrainian or Ukraine might become pro-Russian, but these two things have not happened. Right? Crimea has a claim to be Russian, equivalent to Kosovo's claim to be Albanian but not Serbian. And that led the U.S. and NATO to vindicate that claim with ultimatums, bombs, and blockades in 1999. Crimea is home to the Black Sea Fleet that protects Russia's only exit into the warm water ocean. For Ukraine to open Crimea's bases to the west, as it showed signs of doing in 2014, would be to seize Russia by the jugular. Russia would do anything to prevent this. It will forge an alliance with China, or revise its nuclear doctrines, or develop hypersonic missiles that the West's best defenses won't be able to stop. It has done all three of these things. Trump views Zelensky as someone whose palaver has a good chance of getting people far from the Ukrainian border blown to kingdom come. Right? Trump was absolutely right, saying you are risking World War III. So that's what gave the Friday meeting its drama. Things started off well, but the problem is an ironic one. Right? People who like Zelensky dislike Trump. But Zelensky is the most Trump-like politician in the world. He was not just a TV actor in Ukraine. He was one of the most successful TV producers in Europe. Like Trump, he is obsessed with good TV. If Norman Lear ever had a chance to run a country, it would look either like today's United States or today's Ukraine. Right, this was great. This is going to be great TV, Trump muttered at the end of that meeting Friday with Zelensky. And of course it was, because Zelensky helped to produce it. Right, Zelensky came to this meeting and he did exactly what Trump has done on dozens of occasions. He ignored time-honored formats. He ignored the platitudes and the nods and the signings, and he reshaped the meeting to suit his needs. So instead of talking about how optimistic he was about the deal, he wrote out the greatest hits of the Biden administration's public diplomacy effort, circa 2022, the kidnapped children, the sadistic jailers, the wildly exaggerated numbers of Russian but never Ukrainian dead. So Zelensky understands these events the way that Trump always has. Two parties are going to sign something in a closed room, and all that the voters will know will come from social media. So he tries to spin the agreement he's about to sign in front of the president. He speaks with a straight face, using his poor English to great advantage, as if the pact that he and Trump were about to sign was an arrangement whereby Ukraine would trade its drone technology for American air defense technology. A good deal. He said the document he was about to sign would be unacceptable without security guarantees, which Trump had earlier said would not and could not be part of it. So Trump wants to draw Vladimir Putin away from his alliance with China, and Trump insists he doesn't support either side in the Ukrainian war. I'm here as an arbitrator, as a mediator. Zelensky won't let him off. Putin's a killer and a terrorist. Hope that together we can stop him. Trump was the first one to understand what Zelensky was doing. Others were slower on the uptake. Trump's people emerged from the meeting feeling the way many people do when they emerge from a meeting or a debate with Trump. They didn't feel as if they'd been bested in a new kind of debate. They felt as if they'd been lied to, but it was both. Zelensky played a Trumpian trick, and he won a Trumpian victory. But for now, it looks like a Pyrrhic victory. Wow. Great analysis from Christopher Caldwell.
All President Zelensky had to do was come in and sign this economic agreement and, again, show no daylight between Ukrainian people and the American people, and he chose to blow that up.
So the deal is no longer on the table, just to be abundantly clear.
Not at present.
One White House senior advisor says, I'm not sure this is salvageable. 3 strikes and you're out. It's not like Zelensky wasn't warned. Ukraine-friendly members of Congress were prepping him ahead of time. One person in the room told Politico this. Everyone was giving him the same advice, which was get the deal done. Don't play games, and be very appreciative of everything that Trump and the administration have done. Lead with thank you for everything that you've done and get the deal done. But Zelensky didn't even say thank you, just like he didn't say thank you to Biden. When Biden screamed at him on the phone in 2022 and told him to show a little more gratitude, Zelensky just brushed it off. So what happened? Well, 40 minutes before this meeting in the Oval, Zelensky was meeting with Senate Democrats. Democrat Senator Chris Murphy said, quote, just finished a meeting with President Zelensky here in Washington. He confirmed that the Ukrainian people will not support a fake peace agreement where Putin gets everything he wants and there are no security arrangements for Ukraine. So Murphy got in his head. And less than an hour later, Zelensky starts a fight with Trump and Vance and blows up the deal again. And then Murphy gets on TV and says this.
The White House has become an arm of the Kremlin. Every single day, you hear from the National Security Advisor, from the President of the United States, from his entire national security team, Kremlin talking points. For the last week, the White House has been pretending as if Ukraine started this war. That's essentially saying that Poland invaded Germany at the beginning of World War II.
Look at this dirty little trick. Sabotage a peace deal so you can call Trump a Russian puppet. Democrats don't even have a peace plan.
Impossible. Was the
They
Cold
don't
War?
even have a plan to win this war. Their only plan is to keep it going so you can call Trump a traitor for trying to end it. President Biden was caught telling donors here in Manhattan that this country has never been so close to nuclear Armageddon. All Trump's trying to do is stop World War III. And the American people want it stopped too. 72% of Americans want Ukraine to negotiate a settlement. And 60% of the country agrees with the way Trump's going about it, negotiating directly with Russia. Ending the war lowers energy prices, which brings down inflation. It also heals the world's messed up supply chain, which also brings down inflation. It boosts European defense spending and saves American combat power for the Pacific. Lets us focus on more urgent problems like the Iranians and the Chinese. And these sanctions we have up, they hurt the dollar as the world currency because it drives other nations to trade in other denominations. And it drives the Russians away from a deepening alliance with the Chinese and gives us a new market for minerals, minerals that our tech sector is going to need in the arms race. So Zelensky says he's still ready to sign the minerals deal, but he's got to do one thing first.
I have been told by a senior official here that nothing's going to happen with this minerals deal until Zelensky goes in front of cameras and makes an explicit public apology for the way that he behaved himself.
Okay, let's get some analysis here from John Mearsheimer.
Well, and so we'll certainly see how it's going to happen. Gary, do we still have the Jack Keane shot up, the sound? Do we have that one?
I think it remains to be seen if Putin is really going to negotiate, and that means be willing to make some compromise. He's already come in with a hardline position at the negotiations that took place yesterday, where they said they want more territory than what they're occupying. He wants Ukraine to demilitarize. He wants them to have an election so he can undermine that election successfully, as he's done very much in the past, and hopefully get a stooge in there that he can influence and control. He wants Ukraine to go down to 85,000 troops only and only be able to fire a missile 40 kilometers, 25, 30 miles, in other words. So those are very hard-line positions. It remains to be seen how much progress we're going to make here. But Putin has got major military problems and personnel problems coming in 25. There's a lot more pressure inside on Putin than what is recognized publicly.
Now, that was just hours ago. That was before the explosion in the Oval Office. But it's interesting because the first half of that, he lays out what apparently Russia has said just yesterday, articulating more of what their requirements are, not just the 4 administrative borders of the oblast, but also demilitarization, like genuinely down to 85,000 people and some other limitations as well. They seem pretty adamant on that. But then he pivots over to say that actually it's Russia that's in trouble. Is Russia in trouble?
No, just a couple points here, Danny. One on the demilitarization point. You want to remember that the demilitarization issue was one of the issues that was discussed in the Istanbul Agreement or Istanbul negotiations back in March, April 2022. So this is not new. And I believe that the Ukrainians had accepted the fact that they would have to demilitarize to the point where they did not present an offensive threat to Russia. So that issue is an old one. It's certainly still on the table. And the Russians are not going to compromise on that issue. There are 3 big issues here. One is that Ukraine has to be a genuinely neutral state. It can't be in NATO. There can be no Western security guarantees, which basically add up to de facto membership in NATO. Ukraine has to be NATO. Ukraine has to be neutral. That's point number 1. Point 2 is that the West and Ukraine have to accept the fact that Russia has annexed those 4 oblasts plus Crimea. That's non-negotiable. And then you have the demilitarization point, which is non-negotiable. There may be some minor changes on whether they can have 85,000 troops or 90,000 troops. Who knows? But that's just minutia. The fact is that the Russians have a handful of demands that are non-negotiable. They have made that clear since June 14th of 2024, when those demands were clearly laid out by Putin. Now, General Keene's basic argument is that we can get the Russians to bend because we're in the driver's seat and it's them, the Russians, who are in trouble. This is delusional. The Russians are in the driver's seat. The Ukrainians are in desperate straits. And we are fed up with this war and we want to walk away from it. So Putin is the one who has all the leverage. And I think that Trump must understand very clearly what the Russian demands are, the main demands that I just described, and that he must have conveyed to the Russians that we will accept those demands. Otherwise, there's no point in Trump continuing to negotiate with Putin and continuing to talk as if we can cut a deal. So I think you're going to get the deal that Putin has basically articulated on June 14th and on a number of other occasions moving forward. Yeah. It's very interesting, Danny, but the difference between Biden and Trump is just so stark. First of all, Trump is a much more forceful leader than Biden was. But furthermore, Biden was a warmonger, and Trump, for all his flaws, is not a warmonger. He's interested in shutting the war in Ukraine down, and he's not interested in starting any more wars. He's actually made that quite clear with regard to Iran, where the Israelis would really like us to take out the big stick and pound Iran. And he doesn't want a war with Iran, and he wants to shut this war down. So you have this rather unusual situation where it's Donald Trump who's talking about peace. He's right. The peace president. And it was Joe Biden who was the war president. And
war. It was the alliance of non-communist nations, and they called themselves liberal. Well, there wasn't a liberal world. China wasn't liberal. Didn't care, and Russia didn't follow a liberal policy. And Africa was certainly not liberal. The idea of the liberal world order was a fantasy that was useful to some, but not reality.
Let's talk about Saudi Arabia. In some ways, George, you think they are central to all this. The question, of course, in some people's
So this is George Friedman, who used to be Peter Zion's boss.
minds are, why are these negotiations taking place there? Why are they there? Saudi Arabia is a massive oil producer, but why there? Why not Hungary or somewhere else?
Well, Hungary would have been the logical place because Viktor Orban was close to Putin, close to Trump, and I thought it would be in Budapest. But the fact is, the world is ignoring there's another war going on in the Middle East between Israel and the Arabs, which threatens to draw in the United States and used to threaten to draw in the Russians. The 1973 war, it was a Russian-American war. Now the Russians can't play. The threat to take Gaza was insane, it appeared. But it really was the announcement, this can't go on. This region cannot, every 5-10 years, spasm. The country that did not involve itself in this war, in the Middle East, was the most powerful country. It was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia needs this to stop. It's part of the Abraham Alliance, which, by the way, Trump invented. And now Azerbaijan wants the war, join and everything. And he wants to create a NATO in a place where NATO matters. The Middle East, not Europe now. NATO would be very different and not the same, so I just use that name. So how will the world look? Well, Russia will not decline. It will decline, but not lose its power. China is struggling. It made a play for greatness, and it's not going to be serious, but not great. The Middle East has to be organized. It is the real root of war. The real question that should be asked, the real horror that happened was in the Middle East, and is always in the Middle East. And this is an economically vital area. So the Russians are going to be talking, and Americans will be talking about more than Ukraine. They'll be talking about the Middle East. And they'll be talking about how these oil powers, but really great powers still, are going to handle the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia has to be at that table. Because if you see a new model of the world, it's American power, Russia's still a major power, and Saudi Arabia, the guardian of the Middle East. The United States wants to stop the war in the Middle East, perhaps more than it wants to stop the war in Ukraine.
And what do the Saudis want there?
Saudis want to be the dominant power in the Middle East. They need to be sponsored in this role. Let Saudi Arabia be responsible for Gaza. So the whole Gaza play was a bluff, of course, because these are negotiations and you bluff. We're going to take Gaza like crazy. We're not going to take Gaza. We're telling the Saudis, somebody's got to stop this. If it's got to be us, it's got to be us. But then you're going to be junior to us. How's about you taking the lead, reaching an understanding with Israel, and being responsible for the Palestinians? And this is what's going to be discussed. That's why it surprised me terribly that he decided to hold the meetings in Riyadh. Why Riyadh? So, Geneva, yeah, okay. Riyadh? Because this is more than just a discussion of Ukraine. This is a discussion of the New World Order, in which new nations will emerge and other nations will decline.
Tacking back to Russia then, and of course a major oil producer itself, what does the US want with Russia going forward?
Nothing. Economic relations. Look, the Cold War didn't end with the fall of the communists. Russia remained Russia and was trying to reassert itself without the ideology of communism, but with the power of Russia. Having demonstrated that Russia's power is limited, but still there in some form, Russia now does not represent a threat. We formed NATO for one reason. Russia was a threat. If Russia is not a military threat, then NATO is irrelevant. Europe is different. So the war there and the war in the Middle East changed an understanding in the international system. The idea that Russia is a fixed figure as a threat declined. The American perception of the world changed as a result. The European perception of the world did not. They did not realize that the Russian threat, the Cold War, ended in Ukraine. In Ukraine, Russia demonstrated its limits. And so the organizations, the concepts that were built around the Cold War are not there anymore. Conceptions die hard. Trump, for all his bizarreness, grasped that. And he wanted to construct a new world stable order in which the United States and Russia have no real what do we want for each other? Russia wanted Europe. It failed to get Europe. Let's do business. Saudi Arabia doesn't care about Israel. So why are you supporting these Palestinian movements? Let's do business. Trump is trying to reform the world around reality. The world has not yet accepted there's a new reality, so everything seems obscene to them. The Israelis will go crazy, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and Mearsheimer gave a lecture on Israel and nuclear weapons.
Or proved to be very useful. 1973, most of you are too young to remember this, but in 1973, the Egyptians attacked across the canal, Suez Canal, into the Sinai, and the Syrians attacked in the Golan Heights. The Israelis got caught with their pants completely down. Right, the Great Surprise Attack on October 7th was the second time that Israel has been a victim of an almost complete surprise attack. And the Israelis thought that this was the end. They really did think it was the end because the Egyptians and the Syrians did very well in the first 2 or 3 days of the battle before the Israelis turned the tide. And the Israelis panicked, and Moshe Dayan, who was then the Minister of Defense, went to Golda Meir, who was the Prime Minister, and told her that it was time to get the nuclear weapons out. So she gave him permission to assemble 13 nuclear weapons. So the Israelis assembled 13 nuclear weapons. And they did it in a very obvious way so that we would see it, we meaning the United States. And we would rush huge amounts of armaments to the Israelis to help them stabilize the situation and turn the tide. So in a very important way, those nuclear weapons proved to be very useful for the Israelis in 1973. But they were not useful in the way we usually think about nuclear weapons.
Right, and this is the real clear politics discussion here on straight discrimination.
Arguments that were heard on Wednesday about reverse discrimination. This was a woman named Marlene Ames who started working at Youth Services Department as a secretary back in 2024. Anyway, as things went along, she claims that she's been passed over for promotions for her gay coworkers. The Supreme Court seemed to feel like they were going to maybe take this case. What did you make of it, and what's the significance?
What they're going to do is they're going to strike down a burden that the Sixth Circuit, where this case came out of, layered on to cases involving reverse discrimination. So typically you think about the discrimination cases as protecting groups where there's been historical discrimination. But the law is neutral. And so what the Supreme Court was basically saying today is that the law goes both ways, and it should be applied in the same manner. And what the Sixth Circuit had done, where this case came out of, is they had added an additional condition if you had a reverse discrimination case where you had to prove more than if you were claiming that I was being discriminated against because I was gay, right? So say because there is a history of discrimination against gay people, I don't have to prove certain things. But if you're straight, well, then we're going to make you prove more things in order to carry your burden of proof. And the Supreme Court said basically, and it looked like it's going to be a unanimous case. Ohio was agreeing to it as well. As one of the justices, Neil Gorsuch, said, we're in radical agreement with regard to this issue, that the law is the same and should be applied equally regardless of what a person's status is.
What a novel concept, Richard.
I know.
My gosh.
Yeah.
What's gotten into everybody?
Right. Radical agreement. Radical agreement. I like that.
So, Richard, what are the possible ramifications of this, I guess?
Well, what I think it does is that it kind of ties into the end of DEI, which is, we're moving back. I think the culture is moving back, the law is moving back, and certainly the administration is kind of insisting that we move back to a world where we have an equal application of law, where we move towards a situation of colorblindness as opposed to color consciousness, back to a world of equality as opposed to equity. This has been an ideology that, the Biden administration came in and they dropped the word equality and they started talking about equity. Biden issued a executive order asking every agency to come up with plans for establishing equity. And in this context, what equity means is retributive justice, in the sense that it's a transaction, that if you're black, you get something more. Or if you're another disadvantaged group, you get a special deal. And all that's been tossed out. The administration has revoked that, and we're moving back to a world where equality before the law and equal standing, as I've written before with Real Clear Politics, this is sort of love-based. What makes America so special is this idea that love thy neighbor is really an equalizing force. And that's, I think, where we're going. It's back to a concept that had been enshrined in the law. Martin Luther King used it and amplified it. And we're going back to that standard, I think.
So, Tom, what are the politics of this? I mean, as we move this way, if Richard's correct and we're going in that direction, how does it play out politically, especially for the White House?
I think it's a winner politically. I mean, I think that's, again, the pendulum is swinging back. And to the extent, look, the Supreme Court, to the extent it is a unanimous decision and any of the liberals join in with the conservative members of the court, I think that will give it additional momentum and impetus. There was this editorial in the New York Times on free speech talking about, and this is what Richard framed it perfectly, and that's what the New York Times was writing about. They said, there's a MAGA war on free speech, right? And that the Trump administration, and we talked about, how the AP has changed the style book to become sort of incorporate some of this woke stuff and more progressive stuff over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And that the administrations, the Obama administration and the Biden administration, particularly in the last few years, have injected all of this DEI stuff into the government, into the regulations, into the functioning of these agencies. And the argument of the New York Times basically is that, opposing any of those things is a war on free speech. How can you possibly tell you just don't like this speech, therefore it's a war on free speech? And the idea is that they've managed, the media and the government has managed to move the Overton window, shift it to the left, dramatically in some instances over the last 15 or 20 years. And the Trump administration and other parts of the culture are trying to sort of roll some of that stuff back. And in the minds of the New York Times, and I guess people on the left, that's considered a war on free speech because it's dictating to folks, you can't say this, you can't say that. I think for a vast majority of folks, though, including folks on the right, would say that this is, and this goes back to the Victor Davis Hanson, this is not a revolution. This is a counter-revolution. This is a returning of our politics and our culture to some sort of equilibrium, some sort of stasis that is neutral, that is opportunity-based, and we don't identify and categorize and divide people by their race, their gender, their sexual preference, or whatever. And so in that sense, I think this case is a move in the right direction.
It was interesting.
Richard, you got 30 seconds.
Yeah, the New York Times is arguing that by taking off DEI language out of the websites that the government puts up, that was somehow limiting free speech. Of course, you can go out and argue for DEI in the town square. No one's saying you can't do that. But the idea that the administration can't change its own websites to take out language about policies they disagree with was just nonsense. So it's interesting how, though, they're trying to dress up what they're doing as constitutional issues as opposed to policy issues. And it didn't work, I don't think.
Right. David Sanger is an old New York Times journalist, well respected by his peers, and he believes very much in the liberal international order. He's very upset about what Trump and J.D. Vance said to Zelensky on Friday in the Oval Office. So here's a David Sanger news analysis, and I read his last book on the end of the Cold War and the new Cold War with China. Not very good. Not a very clear thinker. But here's his news analysis, just so silly. Behind the collision, Trump jettisons Ukraine on his way to a larger goal. Well, I would expect that the President of the United States would have a larger goal of putting America first. The President's explosive Oval Office encounter. That's the other thing that I noticed about the news media reports, that it was Trump and J.D. Vance who went over after Zelensky. But when you watch the full 50 minutes, you see for the 40 minutes prior to the explosion, Zelensky was rolling his eyes and using all sorts of contemptuous body language. So the president's explosive Oval Office encounter reflected his determination to put aside alliances and commitments to principles in favor of raw great power negotiations. Well, I would hope that a principle of putting your own people first, your own country first, your own nation first, I would hope that should be a sacred principle. After 5 weeks in which President Trump made clear his determination to scrap America's traditional sources of power. So what do you think are America's traditional sources of power? Well, according to David Sanger, it's alliances among like-minded democracies. What a gay comment. What a ludicrous comment. What a perspective just riddled with AIDS. I mean, the idea that America's strength, its traditional source of power, has been its circle jerks with other like-minded democracies, its rubs and tugs, its reach-arounds with other like-minded democracies. That's never been America's traditional source of power. I mean, how paused is that perspective? Like, how absurd is that? Did you realize that America's traditional source of power was its alliance among like-minded democracies? How like-minded are we? Right. I am more internationalist than Donald Trump. Right. I am not for just scrapping alliances. I would like a pan-Pacific trade and military alliance against China. Like, I am more pro-alliance than MAGA. I'm more pro-alliance than Donald Trump. But our alliances, whether they're with like-minded democracies or dictatorships, right, they're nice, they're good, but they're not our primary source of power. Our primary source of power is that we've been the world's #1 economy since the 1880s, and we have been the world's most powerful military since 1945. That's our source of power. And David Sanger says, Trump wants to return the country to an era of raw great power negotiations. No, Trump is recognizing that we are in an era of raw great power negotiations. Trump is recognizing reality. Trump left one question hanging. How far would he go in sacrificing Ukraine? Ukraine is sacred. Ukraine is everything that America stands for. Ukraine is our highest value. How absurd, how paused, how riddled with AIDS is this analysis to think that the one question left hanging is, how far would Trump go in sacrificing Ukraine to his vision? Ukraine doesn't matter for America's interests. Ukraine doesn't matter for the world. It really doesn't matter. You would think that what's most important for America is American interests, not what happens to Ukraine. Okay, there's just so many absurd things. Trump sees Ukraine as an obstacle to a far more vital project. Yes, right. Every day that the Russia-Ukraine war goes on, we are at risk of World War III. Trump wants a normal relationship with Russia. Yes. That means rewriting the history of Moscow's illegal invasion. Oh, my God, did you know it was illegal? Oh, that is so serious. Well, if I had only known that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was illegal, I would have been so much stronger and so much more vibrant. And, oh, my God, it was illegal. Oh, why won't they leave Ukraine alone? Leave it. Why does Russia have to penetrate Ukraine in an illegal fashion? What the hell? What does it matter if it's legal or illegal? Who's going to enforce, right, the legality of this invasion? Right? How paused is this perspective that, oh, Moscow's illegal invasion, but the American invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, Is that referred to as America's illegal invasion of Afghanistan? You can make a very good case that America's invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was illegal, that America's invasion of Iraq in 2003 was illegal, that Russia's invasion of Panama that America's invasion of Panama in 1989 was illegal. I mean, when we went to war with Serbia, with NATO in 1999, you can make a good case that was illegal, that our war to overthrow Gaddafi was illegal. Right? You could list off 5, 6, 8 illegal American wars if you wanted to make that case. I don't really care if the war is legal or illegal. It's just such a silly analysis. Like when I get immersed in such pause, right, there's only one thing to do, and that is to clean my neshama in the well springs of Torah.
That the Ashkenazim didn't really hold of Rav Ovadia. So therefore, if you want to make sure that you're going to get a heter, you want to make sure that the Ashkenazi Haredim hold of it, you should go to Rav Yoshev. Not that Rav Ovadia thought there's such a thing. I'm a big fan, by the way, of Rabbi Jachter. I read all his books, but I do have a fundamental disagreement with him, because in a number of writings he discusses halachic issues. It could be anything. It could be Shemitah. It could be, he even does this with the dateline. And he says, what's the Sephardic perspective on this? And I say, absolutely, there's no such thing as a Sephardic perspective on the dateline or a Sephardic perspective on Shemitah. There's no such thing. There's just one Torah. By the way, I saw in the Sefer for Rav Shapiro, I quoted you, says the same thing. There's no such concept. Only when there's a disagreement, let's say Ramah and Shulchan Aruch. It's fine if you're a Sephardi and you, for whatever reason, you like to follow Rav Ovadia, fine. But that doesn't mean that Rav Ovadia's psak is not effective for Ashkenazim either. So what happens in the story? That so he goes to Rav Yoshev, and Rav Yoshev didn't want to deal with it. Like Rav Ovadia said, Rav Yoshev didn't want to involve himself in these mamzerus cases. So he came back to Rabbeinu crying. Va'az yashav Rabbeinu v'hitiroso. And then he says, and then Rabbeinu sat and looked at it and was mad to her. Va'amar li Rabbeinu shadavka roya kasha v'hitiroso. And Rav Ovadia says it wasn't even difficult. It wasn't a complicated case. And then, this is on Zion Nisan, the next day, Rav Elio Shitrik is back again with Rav Ovadia. And Rav Ovadia has more to say about this. Rabbeinu hosi for the beriti hayom binyan heter shenatan etmol benosei yuchsed. He continued speaking about the heter he gave yesterday. And he said about Rav Yoshev, hu machmir, me anshe Beit Shammai. Rav Yoshev is a machmir. He's from the Beit Shammai school. They're machmir. Aval harav Tzitz Eliezer v'chein Rav Moshe Feinstein yesh lahem kochad hatera. But he says Rav Moshe and the Rav Waldenberg, they're from what we call a Beis Hillel school. They have the power, the koach hetera, to be matir. So this is definitely a criticism of Rav Yoshev, and I'm a little surprised that it was published here, unless this is a reflection of towards the end there was basically a falling out between Rav Yoshev's people and Rav Ovadia. So, for instance, if you know the story, the Rav Yoshev and his people engineered this chief rabbi, so-called chief rabbi, Yonah Metzger, becoming chief rabbi of the state of Israel. By the way, unfortunately, he's in the news again for something. I hope it's not true. And the whole point was that, well, they wanted to destroy the chief rabbinate and just have a functionary, but they also wanted to make sure the Heter Mechira was not instituted. And Rav Ovadia, who's a big backer of the Heter Mechira, he had to do the Heter Mechira, I think it was Rabakshi Doron then, in his house, because it was not an official government thing, because the other chief rabbi didn't agree. And then later you had the issue with the army conversions, where Rav Yoshev's followers, they started voiding conversions, and they voided Rav Druckmann's conversions, and the army conversions they said were no good. So Rav Amar went to Rav Ovadia, and Rav Ovadia writes a letter affirming all the army conversions. Basically, his attitude was that maybe they were too liberal and lenient on the army conversions, but after the fact, all these conversions are valid. So, and there were attacks on Rav Ovadia. So this could be a reflection of why Rabbi Shitrik decides to publicize this, to let people know that we don't need to shiver in our feet, or we don't need to be concerned with what the Ashkenazi Haredim say about this, because Rav Ovadia is greater than them. This idea, incidentally, of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, where does this come from? Well, actually, this is an old theme of Rav Ovadia, and he brought down the attacks of the Bnei Brak crowd on him, because when he was running for chief rabbi, he said that he will, there's something a little bit distasteful, but as they're running for chief rabbi, they need to get votes. And they don't just need to get the votes of the rabbis, they also need to get the votes of the mayors, etc. Rav Ovadia was advocating what he said, that he would have a user-friendly, let's say, halacha. He said that we, Sfardim, follow in the school of Beis Hillel. And the Ashkenazim they follow Beis Shammai. They're more machmir. And he says, I will follow the school of Beis Hillel. And of course, the people in the Ashkenazi Haredim were quite offended by this. I don't know why the Ashkenazi Dati Leumi weren't offended, but I would think they could be offended also. Because what do you mean? Ashkenazim are Beis Shammai? But that's what he said. Now, what people didn't realize is that this wasn't original to Rav Ovadia. Rav Ovadia was actually quoting the Chidah, Rav Chaim Yosef David Arzalai, the great Chidah from the 18th century. In fact, before Rav Ovadia, the only Sephardic rabbi referred to as, just two Sephardic rabbis were referred to as Maran. Maran is a term that's used, it means like the ultimate. These days, everyone is a Gaon. So who's above the Gaon? Maran. If you look in the Haredi newspapers, Maran means like the Pope, I guess. It's the ultimate, the highest authority. I don't want to use the word Pope, but I mean, that's fundamentally, that's what it is, because like no one can dispute with, if he's Maran, it's often understood that he's the last word. And even today, you have a bunch of Marans. You can even have more than one Maran. There was a time where you just had like one Maran. Rav Shach was Maran, and Rav Steiper let's say Rav Yashiv was Maran. Now I think you can have a bunch of Marans even in the same group, so it doesn't even have the same. You have to come up with a new title, maybe Rosh Kol Bnei Agola or whatever it is. But incidentally, if you look carefully, look at Rav Ovadia, he distinguishes when it's a really great rabbi, it's Hagaon. Let's say Hagaon Rav Moshe Feinstein. If it's just a second level rabbi, it's Harav Hagaon. So Hagaon Harav, you put the stress on the Gaon. Harav Hagaon, the stress is on the Rav. Check out Rav Ovadia's writings, you'll see this. All the top level rabbis, it's Hagaon Rav, and the second level rabbis, it's Rav Hagaon. But so the Chidah was the only. The Shulchan Aruch was always called Maran, Yosef Karo. The Chidah was the only other one until modern times, I think till Rav Ovadia Yosef, to be called Maran. That was the Chidah. So he's very, very important authority. And the Chidah said this. I'll read you what the Chidah says now. You can see this in Meir Ben Yahu's book on the Chidah, page 165. He says, he doesn't actually say Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, but it's the same point. He quotes this in this book. He quotes the Chidah, who's quoting, he begins the paragraph by saying that the Chidah's relationship to the Ashkenazim was bayati. I mean, his mother was Ashkenazi, but let's see. So he cites another rabbi, an Italian rabbi, who says as follows: the Sephardim, they come from the side, speaking Kabbalistically, of Chesed. And the Ashkenazim, they come from Gevura. That is, the Sephardim are kind, and they are gentle, and they are amenable, and the Ashkenazim are Gevura. They're strong, they're firm, they're strict. Because the Ashkenazim come from Gevura, what are they? They're Machmirim Bedinim Kemidas Gevura. Vasfardim, they're Mekilim, because they're Chesed. So Rav Ovadia's point was that the Ashkenazim always like to be Machmir, like Beis Shammai, and the Sephardim are Mekel like Beis Hillel. Okay, let us move on from Rav Ovadia. Now, I just want to say that about Ashkenazim and Sephardim, getting back to this book again by Rav Avram Shapiro, he says on page 368 that a Dayan who doesn't know Ktsos HaChoshen, Toa B'dvar Mishnah, is making a basic error. And if he doesn't know the Nesivos, Toa B'shikul Das, he makes an error, obvious, logical error. So my question is for Rav Avram Shapiro is, what about all these Sephardi Dayanim who, because in their background, they studied Choshen Mishpat and they studied the Sephardic commentaries, they never studied the Ketsos, and they never studied the Nesivos. So they're not reliable Dayanim? Maybe he thought so. I can tell you, because Rabbi Mark Angel reports this, that Rav Avram Shapiro was a machmir on conversions. He's chief rabbi. He's going to play part of our story in the Heimer case as well. So Rav Mark Angel reports that he said to him, well, what about Rav Uziel? Rav Uziel was very liberal on conversions. You don't have to be completely observant. And Rav Avram Shapiro said as follows, and he's saying this about someone he knew, Rav Uziel, and someone who was official chief rabbi, saying that he said that he's not such a great posek. That he's not. So Rabbi Mark Angel wrote his article saying obviously how offended he was, and saw this as Ashkenazic central centrism, I guess, focusing only on what the Ashkenazic poskim. He also mentions, I think it might be the same article, Rabbi Angel, because it was the visit that Rav Avram Shapiro only came to America one time, as far as I recall. Maybe a second, but I think only once. And he came with Mordechai Eliyahu. And Rabbi Angel said to Mordechai, came to Mordechai Eliyahu, he described this in the article. If it maybe was this visit or the next time, Mordechai Eliyahu came a lot. And he said, how come all the Sephardic yeshiva students today dress Ashkenazic in black and white? That's not our tradition. We don't dress that way. And Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu said, but today that's how yeshiva students dress. So Rabbi Mark Angel, as you can imagine, was not very happy with that answer. He wanted Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu to say, you're right, they shouldn't dress that way. Okay.
Okay, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.